Maeve.
Jesse McCoy, you sure took your damn time. You actually came back.
Told you I would. Just took the long road.
What is this?
A promise. And a way forward, if you'll ride with me.
Two 10-year-olds carved their initials into a cedar tree, and one of them made a promise 20 years later. He rode back through a dust storm to keep it, into a town full of coal smoke, corrupt judges, and a woman who never needed saving in the first place. Follow along so you don't miss what happens next. The smoke never really left Oakhaven. It lived in the curtains, in the bed sheets, in the back of your throat, every morning when you swallowed. Coal smoke. It poured from the mine shafts at the edge of town and drifted west on whatever wind came down from the ridges, settling over the rooftops like a gray wool blanket that nobody asked for and nobody could shake off. By mid-October, when the air went cold and the sky pressed down low, it was worse. The smoke had nowhere to climb. It just stayed, thick and sullen, hanging over Oakhaven the way debt hung over most of the people who lived there. Maeve Thornton had stopped noticing it years ago, or so she told herself. She was behind the post office counter when Judge Sterling arrived. She heard him before she saw him, the heavy, deliberate knock of his silver-capped walking stick on the plank floor, three precise taps like a gavel calling order. Maeve kept her eyes on the postal ledger in front of her. She finished the entry she was writing, set the pen down clean, and then looked up. Sterling was a large man, not in any honest physical way, but in the way certain men take up space that doesn't belong to them. He wore a dark broadcloth coat, expensive, brushed that morning by somebody paid not to complain about it. His mustache was silver at the corners. His eyes were the pale, flat color of winter ice over a shallow creek, pretty to look at and nothing beneath. He had two men with him. They stood at his shoulders and said nothing. Miss Thornton. Sterling placed a folded document on the counter between them. He didn't slide it, didn't hand it to her. He placed it, the way a man places a card on a table when he believes he's already won. I trust you've had time to consider your situation. Maeve looked at the document. She did not touch it. I've had time, she said. And? She raised her eyes to his. My answer's the same as it was Monday, Judge, and the Monday before that. Sterling's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind those pale eyes. A tightening. He tapped one finger on the folded paper. This lien is lawful and recorded. $47 in back property taxes on this parcel accrued since your father's last assessment. The county collector has been more than patient. The county collector has been more than creative, Maeve said. That parcel was reassessed 3 times in 18 months. Once at standard rate, twice at the commercial freight tier. This is a post office and a dry goods counter, not a rail depot. The classification is at the magistrate's discretion. Conveniently. Sterling smiled. Then, a slow, careful thing. There is, of course, an alternative arrangement. One that would see this lien dissolved entirely, and your father's name cleared of any outstanding obligation. He paused, letting the silence do the work he'd rehearsed. I have made my personal intentions toward you plain, on more than one occasion, Miss Thornton. A formal arrangement between our households would be mutually beneficial. Maeve picked up her pen. She opened the ledger back to her entry. I appreciate your clarity, Judge. Here's mine. I will not marry you. Not to clear a debt. Not for any reason you've thought of or will think of between now and the day you die. If the lien is valid, I'll contest it before the territorial court. If it isn't, which we both know is the truth of it, then I'd suggest you take that document back and burn it somewhere private. She looked up once more, steady, her voice no different than if she were reading him postage rates. Is there anything else I can help you with today? For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Then Sterling picked up the document, folded it back into his coat, and tapped his walking stick once on the floor. You'll find, he said quietly, that stubbornness is considerably more expensive than cooperation. He left. His 2 men followed. Maeve waited until she heard the door close. Then she set the pen down again and pressed both palms flat against the counter and breathed. Her father appeared in the doorway from the back room, one hand braced against the frame. Arthur Thornton was 61 years old, and he looked older. The coal miner's lung had done that to him, slowly, year by year, the same way water carves stone patient and invisible and permanent. His face was still a strong face, good bones, a veteran's jaw, but the color in it had been going for 2 years now, and the cough that followed him from room to room told the rest of the story. "How bad?" he said. "Same as always." Maeve picked up the pen and put it back in its stand. "Go sit down, Papa. I'll bring you some tea, Maeve." "Please," she said it softer. "Go sit." He went. She stood there a moment longer, alone at the counter, listening to the coal smoke settle. She closed the post office at 4 o'clock, 2 hours early. She told herself it was because the afternoon light was going fast and she had sorting to do. That was part of it. The other part she didn't examine too closely. She took the south path out of town, the one that ran past the old mill pond and up through the stands of lodgepole pine before curving east toward the township boundary. The wind had picked up since noon, carrying something sharper in it now, something that smelled like snowfall still a few days out, but moving with intention. Her coat was good wool, dark green, and she pulled it tighter and walked with her chin down. The boundary cedar stood where it had always stood, at the far edge of the last surveyed lot before open territory began. It was enormous. That tree, older than the town by a long margin, older probably than the names people had given to this stretch of land. Its lowest branches were thick as a man's torso and spread wide enough that the ground beneath them stayed dry even in heavy rain. The bark was rough and reddish, gray, and smelled like something ancient and clean. Maeve put her hand on it, there at about shoulder height, where the bark had grown rough and ridged over the years. You could still find them if you knew to look. 2 sets of initials carved deep by a 10-year-old boy with his father's pocket knife, while a 10-year-old girl held the lantern steady and told him to stop being so slow about it. MT plus J. M. Below the initials, worn now but legible, 4 words. "I'll come back. Promise." She traced the letters with 2 fingers. "You were very sure of yourself," she said to nobody. "For 10 years old." The wind moved through the upper branches, and the cedars sighed in a long, low sweep. She stood there a while, her hand still on the bark, thinking about Sterling's face, and the lien document, and her father's cough, and the $47 that was almost certainly going to become 60, and then 80, and then a number that would swallow them whole. She thought about what she would do. She thought about what she could do. There was a difference, and it was not a comfortable one. Then she heard it. Hooves, not from the town road, from the west, from the open territory side. A single horse, moving at a steady canter, and then slowing as it came through the pine brake. She turned. The rider came in through the dust that the rising wind had kicked up ahead of him, riding it like a ship comes through a swell, steady and unhurried. The horse was a dark bay, broad across the chest, and long in the leg, a horse built for distance. The man on its back sat easy, the way people do when they've spent enough years in a saddle that the horse's movement becomes part of their own breathing. He was tall, she could see that even before he pulled up, wide in the shoulders, dressed in a long trail coat, the color of weathered pine, a flat-brimmed hat pushed back from his forehead. He had the kind of face the territory puts on a person not hardened, exactly, but settled, like something has been decided there, and the deciding was not painless. He stopped the horse at the edges of the cedar's shadow. He looked at her. She looked at him. 20 years is a long time. 20 years changes voices, and fills out jaws, and puts lines around eyes, and scatters gray into hair that used to be the color of dark timber. 20 years takes a boy of 10 and turns him into whatever the world had available and what the boy himself was willing to become. But the eyes. She had always remembered the eyes. Dark brown, almost black, steady and direct, in a way that had made her trust him instinctively when they were children, and did the same thing to her now. "Maeve," he said. Just her name. Just that. Jesse McCoy, she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. You're late by approximately 20 years. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He swung down from the horse in one easy motion, landing in the dry grass, and stood looking at her across about 6 feet of open air. Up close, he was even larger than the trail distance had suggested. But he didn't crowd the space between them. He just stood in it. I would have been here sooner, he said, but Montana is considerable, so I've heard. He looked at the tree, at the initials. He reached out and touched the carved letters the same way she had, one finger, tracing each one. He stood there quietly for a moment, and she let him. You kept the lantern steady, he said. The whole time. I remember that. You told me to. You didn't have to listen. I know, she said. I was just curious how it would turn out. He looked at her then, and there it was, the actual smile, slow and genuine, and still somehow the same smile she remembered, even though everything else about him was different. It stayed only a few seconds before it settled into something more serious. He reached into his trail coat. What he drew out was small, fitting in his palm. A horseshoe, not iron, silver engraved. He held it out to her. The late afternoon light caught it and threw a long gleam across the bark of the cedar. She took it, turned it over. On the inner curve, stamped in small, clean numerals, a set of coordinates. She recognized the format, latitude and longitude, the kind used in land surveys. What is this? She asked. Bitterroot Valley, he said. Montana territory. There's a watershed up there, a spring-fed creek that runs clean even in drought season. I've had the land 3 years. Built the ranch house myself 2 summers back. He paused. The deed's under contest right now. Administrative challenge through the Territorial Land Office. Something to do with occupancy verification and lawful partnership status. I have until February to resolve it, or the claim reverts. Maeve looked at the coordinates, then back at him. And what does that have to do with me? The land office requires what they're calling a qualified co-registrant, somebody literate, somebody with a lawful standing in the territory, somebody whose name on the deed satisfies the partnership provision. He met her eyes straight. I need a partner, Maeve, a real one, not a signature, somebody who'd actually be there, who'd have a stake in it as much as I would. The wind moved again, colder now, and she heard it rattling the dry pine needles overhead. You rode 3 territories, she said slowly, to find a legal partner for your deed contest. I rode 3 territories, he said, because I made a promise to a girl I was 10 years old with, and because there's nobody else I'd trust with it. She was quiet for a moment. The horseshoe was cool in her palm, the engraved numerals precise under her thumb. Jesse, she said his name carefully. You should know what you're riding into. Because it's not simple, and it's not only your problem you'd be solving if you stay here. Tell me so, she told him. All of it, sterling, and the lien, and the manufactured tax assessment, and the marriage proposal, and her father's lungs, and the $47 that would become 80, and the post-office parcel that Sterling wanted because the rail spur was going to run within 100 yards of their front door, and whoever owned that land owned the only level freight access on the south side of town. Jesse listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He stood with his hat in his hands and the wind at his back and listened the way people do when they intend to actually use what they're hearing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. So he's squeezing you into a corner, Jesse said. Either you marry him or he takes the land clean through debt proceedings. That's the shape of it. And the territorial court takes months. Costs money I don't have, and Sterling knows the circuit judges personally. That's not a coincidence. Jesse nodded. He looked at the cedar tree again, at those 2 sets of initials, and then he looked west at the open horizon, where the sky was going violet and iron gray at the edges, the way it does before a storm that intends to follow through on itself. You should also know, Maeve said, what I'm not looking for, because I want that to be clear before this conversation goes any further. She kept her voice level. I'm not looking for someone to purchase my problems. I'm not looking to be owed to someone new instead of owed to Sterling. I've got 2 children I'm teaching to read in the back room of this post office, in defiance of a town council that would prefer they stay ignorant, and I've got a father I intend to keep alive as long as I can, and I've got my own name on a ledger I built myself. She held the horseshoe back out to him, flat on her palm. A partnership means 2 people carrying equal weight, not a man with money rescuing a woman with problems. If that's what you're proposing, you should ride on back to Montana and fight your deed contest some other way. He looked at the horseshoe in her palm. He did not take it back. 2 children, he said. Kitchy and Thomas. Kitchy's 14, indigenous, been on his own since spring. Thomas is 12, ran away from the breaker lines up at Shaft 2. They're good kids. Sharp. They deserve an education, and someone in this town is going to see to it they get one, even if the council doesn't care for it. Jesse was quiet another moment. Then, I didn't cross 3 territories to lock you away somewhere. That's not what I came here for. He said it plainly. No performance in it. What I came for was someone with sense enough and backbone enough to hold the reins beside me. Not behind me, he paused. That land in Bitterroot. It's big enough for what you're already doing here. There's a room in the ranch house I never finished. Kept thinking it needed to be something specific. Took me until I started riding south to figure out what. She looked at him. A schoolroom, he said. The wind hit them both at the same time, a hard gust that bent the cedar's lower branches and sent the dust skipping across the dry grass in long streams. To the northwest, the sky had gone the color of old iron. A storm was building out over the open territory. The real kind. The kind that comes in from the high passes, with intention and mass, and makes the land go very quiet right before it arrives. Maeve closed her fingers around the horseshoe. She hadn't meant to. She noticed her hand doing it before her mind had fully decided. You'll need a place to stay, she said. The loft above the sorting room is empty. It's not much. There's a cot and a stove that works if you're patient with it. I've slept in worse. I imagine you have. She looked at the carved initials one more time. Then she turned toward town, tucking the horseshoe into her coat pocket. Sterling will hear you're here before morning. He'll want to know who you are and what you're doing in Oakhaven and whether you're a problem for him. Jessie fell into step beside her, leading the bay by the reins. The horse walked quietly, ears forward, watching the storm build in the north. Am I? He said. Are you what? A problem for him. Maeve looked at him sidelong. That depends entirely on how long you intend to stay. As long as it takes, he said. Then yes, she said. You're going to be a very significant problem for him. The first gust of the real wind hit them as they came back through the pine brake, cold and sharp and smelling of snowfall still moving down from the high passes. The coal smoke over Oakhaven was pushed sideways by it, streaming east off the mine shafts in long gray banners. The town's lamp windows were starting to come on in the early dark amber squares against the gray-brown of the buildings, and the whole place looked, in that particular light, less like a trap and more like something that could still be saved. Maeve walked through it with her hand around a silver horseshoe, and a man she hadn't seen in 20 years walking on her left. Behind them, the boundary cedar stood at the edge of the mapped world, and on its bark still legible. After all this time, a 10-year-old's promise waited in the dark. It didn't have to wait any longer. The loft above the sorting room was exactly what Maeve had promised, not much. A cot with a wool blanket, a small iron stove with a crooked flue pipe, one window that faced north and rattled when the wind leaned on it, a nail in the wall for hanging a coat. The floor was solid at least, good pine board, and the roof didn't leak in the places that mattered. Jesse set his saddlebags down, looked the space over once, and decided it was fine. He'd spent 3 nights last month sleeping on open ground in a Wyoming pass with nothing above him but stars and weather. This was considerably better. He got the stove going with the wood stacked beside it. Then he sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the storm settle in over Oakhaven. It wasn't a brutal storm, not the kind that closes passes and kills livestock. It was the season's first serious announcement, steady and cold, piling a thin skin of snow on the windowsill and filling the streets below with the sound of wind working its way through any gap it could find. Jesse listened to it and thought about the distance he'd ridden and the woman downstairs and the look on her face when she'd closed her fingers around the horseshoe. He hadn't been sure she would. He'd been fairly sure she was going to hand it back to him and send him north with a polite explanation of why his plan was someone else's problem. She had every right to. 20 years was a long time to hold a person to a promise made in the shadow of a cedar tree. He wouldn't have blamed her. He'd have ridden back to Bitterroot and found another way, but she hadn't handed it back. He pulled off his boots and lay back on the cot, with his arm across his eyes, and was asleep inside of 10 minutes. Because that was one skill the trail had given him cleanly, and without argument, the ability to sleep when sleep was available before the world changed its mind. He was up again before dawn. The post office downstairs opened at 7, and by 6:30 Maeve was already behind the counter, sorting the previous day's mail that had come in on the late coach. Jessie came down the loft stairs quietly, but she heard him anyway. She had that kind of awareness about her not nervous, just alert. "There's coffee," she said without looking up. "Back room. Stove's been on since 5. The back room was where the dry goods side of the operation lived. A long, narrow space with shelves floor to ceiling on both walls, stocked with flour, salt, lamp oil, seed packets, bolts of cloth, canned goods, rope, and a dozen other things a town needs to keep running. There was a work table in the center and a second small stove in the corner with a battered coffee pot on it. Jesse poured a cup and stood there taking inventory of the room. It was more than a storeroom. He could see that in 5 seconds. The table was too big for just inventory work. Its surface scrubbed clean and marked with faint indentations from pencils, pressed hard by hands, still learning how much pressure to use. There were 2 mismatched chairs pushed under it. On the shelf directly behind the table, beside the salt and the lamp oil, someone had arranged a row of books, thin ones, the kind with large print and thick pages, primers and readers well handled, their spines cracked from use, and beside the books, a lantern, trimmed and ready. Jesse carried his coffee back to the front room. "How long have you been teaching them?" he asked. Maeve set down the mail she was sorting. She looked at him with an expression that was partly measuring and partly deciding whether the deserved a straight answer. 8 months for Kitchy, she said. "Thomas, since July." "Town council, no." "The town council believes what it chooses to believe, which is that I run a post office and sell salt and mind my own affairs." She picked up the mail again. "I intend to keep it that way as long as I can." Jesse nodded and drank his coffee and said nothing else about it, which was apparently the right response, because her shoulders settled slightly. The day moved through its ordinary shapes. Jesse spent the morning tending the bay in the livery, 2 lots down, checking the horse's shoes and rubbing the trail stiffness out of his legs with methodical patience. He walked the town's main street afterward, slow and observational, the way you walk a new piece of country before you decide anything about it. He looked at the coal company office, with its brass plate on the door. He looked at the general store, the saloon, the freight office. He looked at the people moving through the cold morning air, their faces down, their coats pulled tight. The particular careful blankness that working people wear in a town where the man who signs their pay also owns the magistrate's bench. He was back at the post office by noon. Maeve fed him soup from a pot she had on the back stove, the same pot that was clearly meant to feed more than 2 people. She didn't say anything about that, and neither did he. At 2 o'clock, a boy came in through the front door. He was slight, 12 years old, dark circles under his eyes, and coal grime so deep in the creases of his knuckles that no amount of washing was going to reach it this season. He wore a jacket 2 sizes too large, which was both too big and not warm enough, and he looked at Jesse with the flat assessment of a kid who has learned to read strangers fast, because the cost of reading them wrong is high. "Thomas," Maeve said from behind the counter. "This is Jesse. He's staying in the loft for a while." Thomas looked at Jesse. Jesse looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You a company man?" Thomas said. "No," Jesse said. "You a lawman?" "No." Thomas thought about this, apparently decided it was satisfactory, and moved past him into the back room. He shrugged off his oversized jacket, hung it on the nail by the storeroom door, Jesse's nail, as it turned out, though Thomas seemed unaware of this, and sat down at the work table, pulling a primer toward him and opening it with the practiced motion of someone who has been doing this specific thing at this specific time for several months. Kitchy arrived 20 minutes later. He was older than Thomas by 2 years, taller, quieter, with dark hair cut short, and the composed expression of someone who has learned to take up exactly the amount of space that is offered, and no more. He nodded at Jesse when Maeve introduced them. Jesse nodded back. Kitchy sat across from Thomas at the work table. Maeve went in with the lantern. Jesse stayed in the front room. He had letters to read, correspondence about the Bitterroot deed from the Territorial Land Office, pages of administrative language that required careful attention. He spread them on the counter and worked through them with a pencil, marking the points that mattered. He could hear Maeve's voice in the back room, low and clear, and the occasional halting sound of a boy reading aloud, sounding out syllables, stopping, backing up, trying again. He kept working through his letters and listened to those sounds without meaning to, and thought about the fact that in Oakhaven, what was happening in that back room was considered a problem, an offense, proof of poor judgment and social disorder. He thought about what that said about Oakhaven. He was still thinking about it when they came through the back door. 2 of them, big men, both in coal company coats, the kind with the syndicate stamp on the breast pocket. They didn't knock. The back door of the dry goods storage opened directly onto the rear alley, and they pushed through it with the blunt assurance of people who are accustomed to doors opening for them whether or not they're invited. Jesse heard the door hit the wall. He was through the connecting doorway before the second man was fully inside. Maeve was on her feet, standing between the men and the table where Thomas and Kitchy sat frozen. The lantern was still on, casting a circle of warm light across the open primer and the 2 boys' hands. The larger of the 2 men took in the room with a sweeping look, the books, the lantern, the boys, Maeve, and then Jesse appearing in the doorway, and his face settled into something unpleasant. "Well," he said, "running a little school back here, are we?" "You're in my property," Maeve said. Her voice was calm, without invitation. "Companies got right of inspection on any commercial premises that hold coal traffic freight accounts." The man produced nothing to support this claim. He didn't need to, and he knew it. "Looks like you're conducting unlicensed educational activities in a commercial freight space. That's a council violation." "Show me the citation," Maeve said. The man smiled. "We're not here for citations." He looked at the boys. "You 2 get out." Thomas didn't move. He was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. Not in fear exactly, but with the rigid stillness of someone deciding whether to be afraid. Kitchy was very still, watching. The second man took a step forward. Jesse moved. He came off the doorframe in a single step and put himself between the second man and the table, with enough deliberateness that the man pulled up short. Jesse was not loud about it. He didn't announce himself or explain himself. He simply stood there in the space the man had been intending to walk through. And at this range, 4 feet, maybe less his physical presence, was a complete argument by itself. "Back up," Jesse said. The second man looked at him. Jesse was not visibly armed. He'd left his sidearm in the loft, which had been a calculation about the kind of day he'd expected to have, but it didn't matter at this distance, and this situation didn't need it. What he had instead was stillness and the look of someone who has been in worse positions than this and exited them intact. The second man backed up. The larger man with the company coat took stock of the situation and made the decision that sometimes men make when they're bigger than most people they deal with and have decided this particular problem is manageable. He reached for Maeve's arm. Jesse caught his wrist before it got there. He didn't twist it, didn't wrench it up behind the man's back. He held it firmly, with the particular grip that comes from years of catching frightened horses and roping steers, and doing work that requires the hands to be precise under pressure. The man tried to pull back and couldn't. "Let go," the man said. "Step back from her," Jesse said. A moment went by. The lantern flame moved slightly in the disturbed air. The man stepped back. Jesse released his wrist. There was a long silence outside. The wind pressed at the back wall. Inside, Thomas was still holding the table edge. Kitchy had not moved at all. "You don't know whose interest you're interfering with," the larger man said. "I've got a fair idea," Jesse said. He moved to the side, a deliberate step that put him equidistant between both men and the table without blocking the back door. He was giving them a clear exit, leaving it uncomplicated for everyone. "Use the door you came in through." They left. The back door swung shut behind them. Jesse walked over and dropped the latch bar across it. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Thomas exhaled a long shaky breath and his grip on the table loosened. Kitchy looked at Jesse with an expression that was measuring, and, after a moment, slightly less guarded than it had been before. Maeve sat back down at the table. She straightened the open primer in front of Thomas. Her hands were steady. "We were on page 31, she said. Thomas stared at her. "That's all you're going to say? What else would I say? They're gone. You're here. Page 31. Thomas looked at Jesse. Jesse looked back at him with a slight raise of his brow that meant, "Roughly, she's right. Let's get on with it." Thomas turned back to the primer. Jesse went back to the front room and his letters, but before he did, he stood in the doorway a moment and looked at the room. The lantern, the books, the two boys at the table. Maeve settling back into her chair with the calm of someone who has been disrupted and has decided not to give the disruption the satisfaction of mattering. He thought about what those two men had seen when they walked in here and called it a violation. An indigenous boy and a coal miner's runaway, learning to read by lamplight in a back room, sitting at a table together without ceremony or distinction. The men had seen a problem. Jesse saw something else entirely. He spent the next 2 days in the livery, not because his horse needed that much attention, but because the livery had decent tools and seasoned lumber in the back corner that the liveryman was willing to sell at a fair price. Jesse bought 8 board feet of good white oak, paid the man in coin, and borrowed a workbench and a set of hand tools. He worked in the mornings when the livery was quiet. Maeve saw him carrying the first piece through the back alley on the second morning and stopped in the doorway, watching him with a look that was trying to decide what question to ask. "Oak?" Jessie said before she could. For the desks, she was quiet for a moment. "Thomas is hard on furniture," she said. "He leans on things." "Oak holds up to leaning," Jessie said, and kept walking. He built 2 of them over those 2 days, small but solid mortise and tenon joints without a single nail, because nails work loose, and loose furniture in a room full of kids becomes a problem inside a month. The tops were smooth planed and waxed, the legs square-cut and braced, sized right for a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old, sitting upright with their arms on the surface, and enough room for a book and a slate. He carried them through the back and set in the storeroom, and leveled each one against the floor, shimming one leg with a thin piece cut off with his knife. Thomas came in that afternoon and stood looking at the desks with an unreadable expression. "Those for us," he said. "Unless you know someone else learning to read back here," Jessie said. Thomas ran his hand along the top surface. The wood was smooth, real smooth, finished properly. He looked at Jessie with an expression that was working hard to stay neutral and not succeeding particularly well. "You made these?" They're not complicated. They look complicated. Jesse pulled the second desk a few inches left to even the gap between them. A man who can read and write doesn't stay in one place unless he chooses to, he said. He kept his voice matter-of-fact, no speech in it. That's the whole point of what you're doing in here. You learn this, you can go anywhere. Do anything that requires a thinking person, which is most things worth doing. Thomas considered this. He pulled out the chair Maeve had placed at his desk and sat down in it and put his arms on the surface and looked at his primer. My foreman at the breaker said, "Reading was for people who had time for it," he said. "Your foreman was managing you," Jesse said. "People who want to keep you somewhere specific will always tell you that the skills to leave aren't worth learning." He straightened up and picked up his tools. "Your foreman can't read either." "That's not a coincidence." Thomas was quiet. Then he opened the primer to page 31 and started reading aloud to himself under his breath, moving his finger along the line. Jesse carried his tools back to the livery. That evening, after the post office closed, and Arthur had been settled in the back parlor with his tea and his newspaper, Maeve came up to the loft. She knocked on the frame at the top of the stairs. The door was open, and waited until Jesse looked up from the deed papers spread across his cot. "Kitchy wants to know," she said, leaning against the frame, "if you know how to track deer. He says he hasn't been able to get a clean read on the herd patterns since October." Jesse set down his pencil. "I know how to track deer," I told him. "You might be willing to take him out before the snow gets too deep." She paused. "If you're not planning to leave immediately." "I told you," Jesse said, "as long as it takes." She nodded, looked at the papers on his cot. "How bad is the deed situation, honestly?" He picked up the top page and read from it. "The land office says the occupancy verification requires, and I'm reading their language here, evidence of established habitation and productive land use by a legally recognized domestic partnership, or co-registration by two qualified territorial residents with documented lawful standing, which means, in plain terms, that a single man living on a piece of Montana land doesn't satisfy their definition of a settled homestead. I need a co-registrant, someone whose name and lawful standing in the territory the land office will accept. How long have you had this land?" 3 years. Built the house in year 2. Put in a kitchen garden, a horse pasture, a barn with 8 stalls. He set the paper down. "It's real land, it's worked land. But the land office opened a review after my original application was challenged by a competing claim from a railroad-affiliated surveying company." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "Sterling has railroad affiliations." "Yes, and your land is in the Bitterroot Valley, which the rail expansion committees have been eyeing for 3 years." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "So this isn't just an administrative complication." "No," he said. "It isn't." Another pause. Outside, the wind was at the north window, pushing at the glass with long, slow pressure. The stove ticked quietly. "I want you to know something," Maeve said, "about what I'm considering." She was choosing her words with care, which he had already identified as one of her habits. The habit of a person who says exactly what she means and doesn't want to waste either person's time saying it imprecisely. "If I agree to this arrangement to traveling north, to the co-registration, to the Bitterroot land, I'm not walking away from what I'm doing here. Kitchy and Thomas come with us. My father comes with us, if his health allows, and I believe it will. And whatever I build in Montana, the school and everything attached to it, that's mine, my work, my purpose, not decoration for your homestead." "I know that, Jesse. I need you to say it plainly." He met her eyes. "What you build is yours. Your school, your students, your decisions about how it runs. I'm not buying a housekeeper, Maeve. I told you that at the cedar tree." She was quiet for one more moment. Then she pushed off the doorframe. "There are men who say the right things," she said. "And then there's everything that comes after the saying." "I know," Jesse said. "So watch what comes after." She looked at him a moment longer. In that particular way she had, measuring indirect and giving nothing away prematurely. Then she went back down the stairs. Jessie sat on the edge of the cot and listened to her footsteps cross the floor below and the sound of the storeroom door, and a long silence in which he imagined her standing at the work table in the lamplight, running her hand across the surface of one of the oak desks. He picked up his pencil and went back to the deed papers. The stove ticked. The window rattled. Somewhere below, a page turned. What came after in those first days was not dramatic. It was ordinary and deliberate, which is its own kind of evidence. Jesse was at the livery each morning before breakfast, tending the bay and putting himself where he could be observed to be exactly what he said. He was a man passing time usefully while circumstances resolved themselves. He carried freight deliveries for Maeve without being asked, the heavy flour barrels and crates of canned goods that came off the weekly coach, carrying them through to the back storeroom while she dealt with the paperwork. He fixed the latch on the front door, which had been sticking, using a plane and 30 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. He cleaned the flue on the back stove, which had been partially blocked and making the coffee taste like ash. He did not make a point of any of it. He was in the front room sorting the day's incoming mail. Maeve had shown him the system, and he'd caught it in one pass when he heard Sterling's man cross the board sidewalk outside and hesitate at the door. The shadow paused in the window glass, peering in. Jesse kept sorting mail. The shadow moved on. That evening at the work table, Thomas read a full paragraph aloud without stopping once to ask for help. He got to the end of it and looked up with an expression he was clearly trying to keep from becoming too obvious. Kitschy, across from him, turned the slate he'd been writing on so Thomas could see it. He'd written, "Good, faster than last week." Thomas read it and then read it again, because reading it was different from being told it. Then he turned his slate around and wrote back, with the careful, deliberate strokes of someone who was still making each letter a separate decision. "You wrote the backward." Kitschy looked at his slate. He had. He erased it and wrote it again correctly, and showed it to Thomas without expression. Maeve, watching this from her chair, said nothing. She didn't need to. Jesse was at the doorway. He'd come in from the front room with a mug of coffee and stopped there, one shoulder against the frame, watching the two boys write to each other on their slates. The lantern light spread across the table, across their hands, across the open primers, and the smooth oak surfaces. He thought about the coal company men who'd walked through that back door 3 nights ago and seen this and called it a violation. He thought about what it cost Maeve to keep this room lit, not in money, in the daily decision to keep going, to keep the door open, to keep the lantern trimmed, in a town that preferred certain people stay in the dark. He stood there a moment, holding his coffee, watching. Then he went back to the front room and finished sorting the mail. Outside, the coal smoke pressed against the windows, and the wind came down from the Wyoming ridges, and the lamp in the back room of the Oak Haven post office stayed on. The alarm bell started at 6:30 in the morning. It was the big bell mounted on the coal company's dispatch tower, the one they used for shift changes and fire warnings, and when it rang wrong, not the measured single tone of a shift call, but fast and frantic and uneven, everyone in Oak Haven knew the difference. Maeve was behind the post office counter, opening the morning mailbag when she heard it. She stopped, listened, counted the pattern. Wrong, all wrong. She had her coat off the hook before the second volley finished. Jesse was already coming down the loft stairs, boots on, coat in hand. He didn't ask her what it was. He'd heard enough emergency bells in enough different places to read the urgency in the rhythm. He pulled on his coat as he came through the front room. "Which shaft?" he said. "Shaft 4 is the nearest. South end of the mine complex." She was already at the door. "It's the oldest one. They've been pulling double crews through it since August." They went out into the gray morning together. The street was coming alive with movement, men in work clothes running south, women standing in doorways with their hands pressed to their mouths, a pair of horses tied at the saloon post, shying at the noise. The air smelled of coal dust and cold, and something else underneath, a heavy mineral scent that Maeve couldn't name, but that made her move faster. The mine complex was 6 blocks south and 1 block west, and by the time they reached it, 30 or 40 people had already gathered at the perimeter fence. The dispatch foreman was there, shouting instructions to nobody in particular, his face the color of old ash. 2 men were hauling a rope spool out of the equipment shed. A third was on his knees at the main shaft collar, pressing his ear to the ground. A coal company supervisor, Maeve, recognized a man named Holt, heavy through the middle, with a permanent squint, was standing 15 feet back from the shaft entrance, with his arms crossed. Maeve went straight to the foreman. "How many men are down there?" 11, the foreman said. He was a lean older man named Cal, 23 years in the mine, and his voice was level, but his hands were not. "Shaft 4, level 2. We had a timber fail at the main support cross about 40 minutes ago." Took out the primary ceiling brace. The whole interior face came down. "Is the shaft still open?" "Partially. Main entries blocked about 30 feet in. There's a secondary ventilation bore on the east face, but it's narrow, maybe 18 inches across." He looked at Jesse, registering him for the first time. "Who are you?" "Jesse McCoyd, Montana." "What's the air situation?" Cal looked at him with quick assessment and apparently decided the directness of the question was sufficient credential. "Unknown. If the collapse blocked the main airflow channel, they've got maybe 2-3 hours before it turns bad. If the bore stayed clear, they've got more time." He looked toward the shaft entrance. "Problem is, we can't get equipment down through the collapsed section without risking a secondary fall. She's not stable." Holt, the company supervisor, had drifted closer during this exchange. "We have protocol for shaft emergencies," he said. He addressed this to the foreman, not to Jesse or Maeve. "We wait for the company's safety inspector from Cheyenne. He'll be here by nightfall." Everyone within earshot went quiet in a particular way. Maeve turned and looked at Holt. "Nightfall," she said. 11 men, 2 to 3 hours of air. Protocol exists for a reason. Those men will be dead before your inspector's horse clears the county line." She turned back to Cal. "What do you need?" Cal looked at Jesse, again the kind of look that was silently asking a question. Jesse answered it by stepping forward. "Show me the bore." The ventilation bore was on the east face of the shaft. Housing, a round cut in the rock, roughly 18 inches wide and dropping at a steep angle into the darkness below. Someone had wedged a lantern on a stick down into the upper section, and its light reached about 8 feet before the bore curved and swallowed itself in black. Jesse lay flat on the cold ground and put his head into the opening. He stayed there for a moment, breathing, listening, gauging the air current, moving against his face. There was one, faint but real. He pulled back out. "Air's moving," he said. "Not blocked. The crew has more time than you think, but not infinite." He looked at the bore's width and then at himself, the breadth of his shoulders, and made the obvious calculation. "I can get down this far. Past the first curve, it's going to be close. It's 30 feet of bore before it opens into the level 2 gallery," Cal said. "Last 10 feet, the rock narrows. I've been in narrow spaces." Jesse was already shedding his trail coat. He handed it to Maeve without looking, and she took it. "I need a rope, a second lantern, and someone who knows the level 2 layout well enough to tell me where to look for the men once I'm through." Cal raised his hand. "I know it." "Then stay at the top of this bore and talk me through it, Jesse." Maeve said at once, flat, not a question or a plea, just his name, and he looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going in after you. I've got medical training. I spent 2 years assisting Doc Hensley before he left town. If any of those men are injured, you'll need me down there." He looked at her. She was smaller than him by nearly a foot, and the bore's tight section would be far less difficult for her than for him. She was also looking at him with an expression that made any counter-argument feel like a waste of the time those 11 men did not have. "Stay close behind me," he said. "Touch the rope if anything shifts. Understood. Holt stepped in. This is company property. Nobody goes into that shaft without company authorization. Jesse turned and looked at him, just looked at him. It was a very still look, very quiet, and it lasted about 4 seconds. And at the end of those 4 seconds, Holt stepped back and stopped talking. The crowd around the shaft entrance had grown. Maeve saw miners who had come off the night shift, still in their work clothes, crowding in close. She recognized some of them men who'd bought flour at her counter, whose wives had come to the post office to send letters home. They were watching Holt, and they were watching Jesse, and the quality of their watching was the quality of people who were deciding something. Jesse took the rope from the equipment man, looped it over his shoulder, and tested the second lantern. He looked at Maeve. She had pulled her coat off and tied her hair back, and she was ready. They went in. The upper section of the bore was manageable, steep and rough-walled and cold, but Jesse moved through it on his elbows and knees, with the controlled economy of someone who'd had to move carefully in difficult terrain before. The lantern went ahead of him on the rope, throwing a swaying circle of yellow light on gray rock. Maeve came behind him. She could hear him breathing, and she timed her own movement to his, following the rope's line, keeping contact with the cold stone on both sides. The sound of the crowd at the surface fell away in the first 20 feet, replaced by the deep mineral silence of the mine, a specific silence, not empty but contained, as though the rock itself were holding its breath. The first curve was manageable. The second was not. The bore narrowed at the second curve to something that required Jesse to turn his head sideways and exhale fully and pull himself through on one arm while pushing with his boots. The lantern rope snagged briefly on a rock outcropping, and he stopped, freed it carefully, kept moving. The rope tied to his ankle, the rope that ran back to Cal at the surface, went taut twice, and he paused each time, waited, felt at ease, moved forward. Then the bore opened. He came out of the bore and into the level 2 gallery, like coming out the wrong end of a rifle barrel, falling the last 1.5 feet onto a shelf of broken shale before catching himself on both hands. He got the lantern up immediately and looked. The gallery was a worked rock tunnel, roughly 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, with timber support frames 6-foot intervals. Or it had been 30 feet. To his left, the tunnel was a wall of collapsed material, broken timber, fallen shale, compressed coal earth. The collapse site. The dust was still settling from it in slow curtains, drifting through the lantern light. He heard the men before he saw them. Maeve came through the bore behind him, landing on the shale shelf and catching her balance without making noise about it. She straightened up and looked at the collapse, and then looked the other direction down the tunnel where Jesse was already moving the lantern. "Hello," Jesse called. His voice carried and bounced in the enclosed space. "Anyone down here? Call out." Silence. Then, from somewhere past the next timber frame and around a cut in the wall, a voice. Weak but real. "Here. We're here." Gallery B cut, past the number 7 frame. They moved fast. Gallery B cut was a side tunnel branching off the main level 2 corridor, and they found the men there, all 11 of them, pressed back against the far wall in a group, the way people press together in the dark, when the alternative is being alone in it. 3 lanterns among them, 2 of them still burning low. The men were coated in coal dust, eyes wide and white in the lantern light, and they were breathing. They were breathing. That was the main thing. 2 of them were not doing it well. Maeve went immediately to the 2 men sitting against the wall at the far end, the ones who weren't standing. One of them had a gash along his forearm, deep and still bleeding. A timber edge on the way down had caught him. The other man was conscious but holding his ribs, his breathing short and hitched. "I need cloth," she said. She was already beside the first man, her hands on his arm, pressing with her palm. "Someone give me a shirt. Anything clean." 3 men immediately started stripping off outer layers. Jesse assessed the structural situation while she worked. The collapse at the main tunnel was a problem. The bore back to the surface was the only exit, and while it was navigable for one person at a time, getting 11 men through it, especially 2 who were injured, was going to take time and careful sequencing. But the bigger problem was overhead. In the gallery cut, 2 of the timber support frames showed stress fractures at the joints, not collapsed, but working. He could see it in the way the frames were leaning slightly inward, compressing under a load that had been redistributed by the main collapse. The secondary pressure was migrating, looking for a new path through the rock above. If those 2 frames let go, while people were moving through the gallery, the ceiling section above would follow them. He needed to shore them up. He looked at the timber debris around him. The collapse had brought down broken beams, but not all of them were useless. There were pieces long enough. A miner near him was watching him assess the frames, a broad-shouldered man, older, with the particular steadiness of someone who has been underground long enough to stop panicking about it. "You see what I see?" Jesse asked him. The miner looked at the frames. "Number 3 and 4, from the cut entrance." "Yeah, they've been working since the main gave way. I need help setting a temporary cross brace. Do you have a mallet or anything that passes for one?" The miner produced a short-handled pick from his belt. Close enough. They worked. Jesse located 2 pieces of fallen timber that were still solid, cut clean enough at the break to be used as vertical supports. He and the miner positioned the first piece under the right side of the compromised frame, seating the base against the rock floor and driving it upward against the frame joint with the pick used as a hammer, using the force of the blows to compress the timber tight into the gap. It wasn't elegant. It was functional. The frame stopped its inward lean and held. The second brace took longer because the second frame had shifted at the base plate, and the floor below it was uneven shale that didn't want to hold a vertical load. Jesse knocked a piece of stone loose with his boot, found the solid rock below it, reseated the brace base, reset the timber. The miner drove it home. It held. Jesse stepped back and looked at both frames. Still under stress, but stable enough. Stable enough for long enough, which was what mattered. Across the gallery, Maeve had the first man's arm bound with strips, torn from 2 donated shirts, wrapped tight above the laceration, and then over it, applied with clean, even pressure. The bleeding had slowed significantly. She was with the second man now, the one with the ribs, her hands moving across his side with careful, deliberate examination. "1 rib, possibly 2, she said to him, low and direct. "Cracked, not through. It hurts badly, but it won't kill you, and it won't puncture anything if you move carefully. I'm going to bind your ribs, and you're going to breathe through your nose, slow and steady, and you're going to be able to walk out of here. Understood?" The man looked at her. He was 40, maybe, with a gray-streaked beard and the kind of exhausted face that the mines put on people. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good." She took the remaining cloth strips and began binding his torso with practiced efficiency, wrapping from below the injury upward, firm and even. "Breathe out," she told him. "Now breathe in slowly there. That's the right tension." The man breathed. It clearly still hurt. He did it anyway. Jesse watched her for a moment, not long, just enough to register what he was seeing. Her hand certain, her voice steady, no wasted motion. No performance of calm, just actual calm. The functional variety that comes from having decided in advance that panic is not going to be part of your response kit. He pulled his rope and gave it 3 sharp tugs, the signal to Cal at the surface. Found them, beginning extraction. The rope tugged back twice. Understood. Getting 11 men through the bore took 40 minutes. Jesse went last, sending the uninjured men first, in groups of 2, with the injured men 5th and 6th, with Maeve talking each of them through the narrow section by voice from outside the bore, calm, sequential instructions, where to put their hands, when to exhale, where the floor of the bore would drop, and how to absorb it. The man with the bound arm made it through, with help from the man in front of him. The man with the ribs made the narrow section in silence, with his teeth set and came out the other end on his knees and stayed there a moment before two sets of hands reached in and helped him up. Jesse came through last, pushing the lantern ahead of him on the rope. When he came out of the bore and stood up and looked around, the east face was crowded with people. The 11 miners. Cal. Cal gripping Jesse's arm with both hands and not saying anything. Maeve beside the man with the ribs, checking the binding. Townspeople and off-shift miners and two women who had clearly run there from their homes still in their kitchen aprons. Holt was nowhere visible. Cal looked at Jesse. His eyes were red at the rims. You got all 11. The air was better than you feared, Jesse said. Secondary bore kept the flow. 11 men, Cal said again, like the number needed to be said twice to be believed. 11. Jesse looked at the shaft housing. Those frames in Gallery B are braced but temporary. Anyone who goes back in there needs to reset the primary supports on level 2 before they pull another shift, and shaft 4 needs a full structural inspection before anyone goes back to work. He said this loudly enough that the miners around him heard it. They looked at each other. Some of them nodded. One of the miners, young, maybe 20, still shaking slightly from an hour of sitting in the dark underground, said, Holt'll have us back on shift by morning. He always does. Jesse looked at him. The frames in that gallery will not hold a shift crew. I set 2 emergency braces with scrap timber, and they'll hold for hours, not days. Anyone who goes back in before those primary supports are reset is going into an unsafe shaft. That's not a complaint or a negotiation. That's a structural fact. The young miner was quiet. If your supervisor tries to run a shift through an unsafe shaft, Jesse continued, his voice the same as it had been throughout level, factual, not elevated with anger, that's not a working condition. That's a deliberate endangerment. You have the right to refuse an unsafe working order. Every man here does. The circle of miners was very quiet. An older man near the back said, Company will fire anyone who refuses. A fired man can find other work, Jesse said. A dead one can't. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not telling you what to decide. I'm telling you that you have the right to decide it. That's not the same as following orders from a man who wasn't willing to go down there and check the frames himself. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Cal very quietly said, He's right. The young miner looked at Cal then, at Jesse. Then he nodded once slowly. Maeve had come to stand a few feet from Jesse. She was dusty from the bore, a streak of coal grit along one cheekbone, her hair half out of its tie, her hands marked with dried blood from the miner's arm. She looked at him with an expression that was taking inventory of something, adding things up, comparing numbers against an earlier estimate. Both frames? She said quietly. Both frames. He looked at his own hands. The second one was the problem floor was uneven. But you got it. Took longer than it should have. Jesse. She waited until he looked at her. You got it. He looked at her for a moment. The morning had gone fully bright around them while they'd been underground, winter sun on coal-dusted snow, sharp white light cutting across the mine complex. Her face in that light was steady and direct and marked with the work they'd just come from. And she was looking at him the way she'd looked at those timber frames, assessing the load, checking the joints, determining whether what she saw was structurally reliable. He held her gaze and let her look. Whatever she found there, she seemed to find it satisfactory. She nodded. Once, a small motion, to herself more than to him. They walked back toward town through the winter morning, coal dust in their coats and cold air in their lungs, with the alarm bell still ringing somewhere behind them. One of the newly rescued miners had climbed the dispatch tower and was ringing it in a different pattern. Now, slow and clear and deliberate. Not an emergency signal. The other kind. The kind that means everyone is accounted for. Everyone came back. It's all right now. Maeve listened to it as she walked. After a while, she said, without looking at Jesse, I thought I had a fair sense of who you'd become. From the letters, you never wrote back, he said. I read them, she said. I thought I had a sense of it. From that, she was quiet a moment. I was partially right. Only partially? She glanced at him sideways. "You're better at the timber work than I expected." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. They walked the rest of the way back in silence, side by side in the winter light, with the bell ringing behind them and the coal smoke overhead, and 11 men alive in Oakhaven who had gone to work that morning, not knowing how the day would end. The town had seen who came when the alarm rang wrong. It had also seen who stayed back. That information moved through Oakhaven the rest of that day, the way information moves through small places. Quietly, person to person, at counters and in doorways, and by evening it had settled into the general understanding of the town like a new kind of weather. Something had shifted. Something in the local arithmetic of who was reliable and who was not had been visibly, publicly recalculated. Jesse didn't know that. He was back in the loft by mid-afternoon, washing coal dust off his hands and face in the basin, and looking at his deed papers. Maeve knew it. She heard it in the way the evening customers at the dry goods counter spoke to her, a slight change in register, a directness that hadn't been there before. She heard it in what people didn't say as much as what they did. After closing, she stood at the storeroom door and looked at the 2 oak desks in the lamplight. She thought about the way Jesse had moved in that gallery. Not reckless, not heroic in any performed sense. Methodical, competent, reading the situation and responding to what was actually there rather than what fear suggested. Setting the brace because the brace needed setting. She thought about him standing in the circle of miners saying, "A fired man can find other work. A dead one can't." No speech in it. Just the information, stated plainly, given freely, offered to people who were going to have to figure out what to do with it themselves. She turned the lantern down and went upstairs to check on her father. Arthur was asleep in his chair by the parlor stove, his newspaper in his lap, his breathing slower than she liked, but even. She stood in the doorway, watching him breathe for a moment, the way she did every evening now, counting the seconds between his inhales. Then she went to write a letter, not to Jesse, to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. She had questions about co-registration procedures and the documentation required, and she wanted the answers in writing. The Harvest Charity Auction had been an Oakhaven tradition for 11 years. It started back when the town was young enough to still believe in the idea of itself that a coal mining settlement in the Wyoming Territory could be a community, not just a company operation with houses attached. 11 years on, the belief had worn thin in some places and worn through entirely in others, but the auction persisted anyway, because traditions in small towns persist long after the reasons for them have changed shape. It was held in the freight depot, the largest indoor space in Oakhaven, a long building with a high timber roof and double doors at each end that could be thrown open in good weather. In late October, the doors stayed shut, but someone always hung storm lamps from the ceiling crossbeams. A dozen of them, maybe more, and in their amber light, the depot floor became something almost festive. Tables went up along the walls. The ladies' auxiliary ran a food spread. The miners and their families came in their best clothes, which was a different category of best than what Judge Sterling and his associates wore. But everyone was there, and for a few hours the freight depot stopped smelling like coal and started smelling like wood smoke and roasted corn and something close to goodwill. The auction itself raised money for the community fund, supposedly. In practice, in recent years, the proceeds had been quietly redirected toward whatever Sterling designated as a town priority, which meant the community fund was largely theoretical. But the auction happened, and people came, and for one evening in October, Oakhaven tried to remember what it had meant to be a town. Maeve attended every year. It was part of the post office's civic participation, she told anyone who asked, which was true, and also not the complete reason. The complete reason was that she watched the auction closely and tracked where the money went and kept her own records. Information, her father had told her when she was small, is not the same as knowledge, but it is the raw material. You collect it faithfully, and you think about it carefully, and eventually, you know something worth knowing. This year, she went with Jessie on her left and Thomas on her right, and Kitschy walking slightly behind them. In the particular way, Kitschy moved through public Oakhaven spaces present, but not asserting it, an old habit of self-protection that 2 months of backroom schooling had not yet fully unwound. Arthur had stayed home. His cough had been worse in the damp cold of the afternoon, and he'd tried to argue about it, and Maeve had won the argument in under 2 minutes and kissed his forehead and gone. The depot was already full when they arrived. The storm lamps were lit and the food spread was out, and the auctioneer, a small energetic man from the freight office named Dix, was setting up his podium at the far end. People turned when Maeve's group came in. The way people turn in small places when anything notable enters a room, and there was a current of low conversation that moved through the crowd ahead of them. Jessie had been in Oakhaven 2 weeks now. The shaft rescue had moved through town conversation, like water through cracked rock into every space, eventually unavoidable. People knew his name. They watched him with the particular attention that small communities give to an unknown element that has already proven itself useful and hasn't yet proven itself dangerous. Sterling was there, near the front of the room, with 2 associates and his walking stick and the broadcloth coat, and he watched Jessie walk in with the focused assessment of a man recalculating his position. Maeve saw Sterling see Jessie. Jessie saw Sterling see him. Nothing passed between them. Jessie took a cup of coffee from the table near the door and found a place to stand where he could see the full room. Maeve went to find a seat for the auction. The first hour went ordinarily. Dix worked through the items on the docket: a cord of seasoned firewood, a quarter side of cured beef, 2 bolts of good wool cloth, a set of kitchen copperware. The bidding was lively on the copperware and modest on everything else. The crowd was warm, and the storm lamps were doing their work overhead, and for a while it was possible to believe the evening was simply what it presented itself as. Then they got to the public right-of-way leases. This was new. Right-of-way leases had not been auction items in previous years. They were administrative matters, handled through the town council's land committee, and their appearance on the auction docket, under the notation community. Revenue instrument. Bid required was not something most people in the room had been prepared for or had previous experience evaluating. Maeve had. She'd read the docket carefully when it was posted 2 days ago. Right-of-way leases controlled who could use which sections of the public thoroughfare's alley access, freight passage routes, loading areas. The specific leases on the docket tonight were the alley corridor behind the post office parcel and the loading area adjacent to it. If those leases went to a private bidder, that bidder controlled freight access to the post office's dry goods operation. They could set their own terms for passage. They could make those terms prohibitive. They could effectively choke the dry goods business without touching the building itself. Maeve sat very still while Dix read the lease descriptions. Beside her, Jessie stood with his coffee, listening to each item with the careful attention he brought to deed documents and structural assessments. The bidding started. Sterling's associate opened at $40. A coal company clerk bid $45. Sterling's associate went to $60. The clerk dropped out. Another associate of Sterling's came in at $65. Maeve bid $70. The room turned to look at her. Sterling's associate went to $90. Maeve bid $95. Sterling's associate watching Sterling, not the podium, went to $120. Maeve had $130 in the post office operating account. She knew it to the penny. If she bid everything and won, she'd have almost nothing left for the month's inventory. If she bid everything and Sterling drove it higher, she'd be out of the auction, and the lease would go to him anyway. Sterling, from his position at the front of the room, smiled. Jessie set down his coffee cup. $150, he said. The room went quieter than it had been all evening. Sterling's associate looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at Jessie. His expression hadn't changed still. that careful, confident smile, but something behind it had shifted, the way a river changes when something large enters the current. Sterling nodded slightly. His associate bid 175. Jesse said, without any particular emphasis, 200. He reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers from an inside pocket, held them up briefly, and then set them on the table beside him. Bank drafts. Montana Bank, clearly visible on the header of the top page. The amount printed there was not a small number. Several people near Jesse craned to see. The draft amount moved through the crowd in low murmurs. Sterling's associate looked at Sterling again. Sterling's smile had not moved, but it had become a different kind of expression. Still a smile technically, but doing different work now. He shook his head. Once. Very slightly. His associate sat back. $200, Dick said, his voice a pitch higher than it had been. Going once. Going twice. He brought his gavel down with the kind of satisfaction that a man feels when the evening has gotten considerably more interesting than expected. Sold, too. He looked at Jesse. McCoy, Jesse said. Jesse McCoy. Sold to Mr. McCoy. The room exhaled collectively. Maeve looked at Jesse. He was folding his bank drafts back into his coat with the calm of someone putting away a letter he's finished reading. He picked up his coffee again. You just spent $200 on an alley lease, she said quietly. The lease has a 90-day transfer clause, he said, equally quiet. I'll sign it over to you tomorrow morning. She looked at him for a moment. Jesse, he was going to use it to strangle the dry goods income, Jesse said. Then the debt goes up, the lien gets harder to fight, and he's got a cleaner path to forcing the sale. The alley access was the pressure point. He looked at her steadily. I had the money. It was the right move. It was $200. It was. He paused. The Bitterroot Ranch turned a profit on the fall horse sale. I had it with me in case the land office required a good faith bond for the deed contest. He was quiet a moment. Sterling doesn't know how much I have. Now he has to guess. Maeve sat with this. Around them, the auction had resumed with a box of seed stock, and Dix's voice was back to its ordinary pitch, and people were settling back into their conversations, though the settling was not complete, and the glances toward Jesse and toward Sterling were frequent. He won't forget this, she said. I know, Jesse said. I'm not trying to make him forget. I'm trying to make him careful. The auction ended at 9 o'clock. Dix announced the grand total, raised for the community fund $340, considerably more than any previous year, owing in large part to the alley lease bidding war, and the crowd applauded with the genuine enthusiasm of people who understand that numbers that size don't appear at their events often. Then someone, nobody could later agree on who it started with, called for the dancing. The freight depot's central floor cleared. 3 men with a fiddle, a guitar, and an upright bass appeared from somewhere near the back and set up in the corner, and the storm lamps overhead took on a different quality, warmer, less practical, more like the kind of light that gives people permission to be something other than exhausted. Maeve stayed near the wall, with her arms crossed, and watched the floor fill up. Thomas had found 2 boys his approximate age near the food table and was in an animated conversation with them that involved a lot of gesturing. Kitchy was near the door, watching the dancing with an expression that was interested but not ready. She'd check on him in a few minutes. Sterling crossed the room toward her. He moved at an angle, unhurried, using his walking stick, with the precise taps that she'd learned to read as a deliberate affectation authority, performed for the benefit of anyone observing. He stopped 2 feet from her with his hands on the stick's silver head and looked at the dance floor. A productive evening, he said. For some, she said, your associate overpaid considerably for an alley easement. He can afford it. Sterling was quiet for a moment. The fiddle was starting up. A slow waltz pattern, clean and familiar. The territorial court review on your lien will be scheduled for January, he said. Which you know as well as I do, puts. The hearing past the worst of winter travel, which means your witnesses and documentation will have difficulty arriving in any timely. Fashion. The court tends to rule on what's present. He paused. The offer I made you remains open. It would be a far cleaner resolution for everyone. Everyone meaning you, Maeve said. Everyone meaning the Thornton family, Sterling said, and his voice carried a thread of something that wanted to be taken for concern and was not. Your father is not well. The winter is going to be long. The lien accrues interest monthly. By January, Miss Thornton, Jessie's voice, close, and she turned. He was standing just behind her left shoulder, looking at Sterling with the same quiet directness he'd turned on Holt, at the mine shaft, not aggressive, not performing anything, just completely present in the space he occupied. Sterling looked at him. I believe this is a waltz, Jessie said. He was talking to Maeve, but he hadn't looked away from Sterling yet. He did now, turning to her, and he held out his hand palm up, a plain offer, no ceremony to it. Maeve looked at his hand. She looked at Sterling. She took Jessie's hand. They walked onto the floor while Sterling stood at the wall. Jessie McCoy was not a ballroom dancer. That was clear from the first measure, but he was a man who had good instincts about bodies in motion, horses, equipment, terrain, the physics of large and living things, and a waltz at its core is just weight and rhythm and trust. He found the beat in the first 4 steps and held it. And he held her correctly with his right hand at her back and her hand in his left, the proper distance between them and enough firmness in his lead that she could follow it without guessing. They turned once through the full floor before either of them spoke. Sterling was threatening you, Jessie said. It wasn't a question. He was explaining my situation to me, Maeve said. He does that periodically. He believes if he describes the problem often enough, I'll become convinced he's the solution. Is he right about the January court date? Probably. The circuit court's winter schedule favors delay. Jessie turned them through the upper corner of the floor, steady and unhurried. Around them, other couples moved miners and their wives, the hardware man and his sister, Dix the auctioneer, turning enthusiastic circles with someone's grandmother. The bank drafts I showed tonight, Jessie said. The amount on the top page, that's the full operating account from the fall horse sale. Sterling will have someone read it before morning if he doesn't already know. Will that be a problem? Maeve asked. It'll make him think twice about the lien proceeding. A contested lien against a property co, registered to someone with documented liquid assets, is a much more difficult legal action than a lien against a woman running a post office on a tight margin. He paused. But it'll also make him angry. Cornered men with money and magistrate connections get creative. Maeve thought about that. They turned through another measure, the fiddle pulling the tempo slightly faster, and she adjusted her steps without thinking about it. I didn't want this to be your fight, she said. I know, Jessie said. He was quiet for a moment. Then I didn't cross 3 territories to lock a woman away in a Montana kitchen. I came for a partner bold enough to hold the reins beside me in the snow. She looked at him. They were close enough in the dance that she could see the exact quality of his expression, not performing anything, just saying the truth of it, the same way he'd stated the structural fact about the gallery frames. Here is what is actually there, assessed as clearly as I can manage. That's a considerable statement, she said. It's a considered one, he said. The waltz moved them toward the center of the floor, and for a few measures they were among other couples, turning and returning, the storm lamps overhead, throwing their amber light across the room in sweeping arcs. Maeve was aware of the room watching them, not all of it, but enough of it, the particular social attention of a small town observing something new and assessing its meaning. She was also aware of Jessie's hand at her back, steady and without excess, and the way he led, not pulling, not pushing, just creating a clear direction and leaving her the decision to follow it. She thought about the bore at the mine shaft. She thought about the oak desks. She thought about him standing in the circle of miners and saying, plainly, that they had the right to decide for themselves. She thought about the letter she'd sent to the Helena land office and the reply she was expecting before the month's end. I wrote to Helena, she said, about the co-registration. Jessie's hand at her back shifted slightly, not a flinch. An adjustment, the readjustment of a person who has received information they were waiting for, but hadn't expected to receive just here. "And?" he said. "They replied yesterday. I've been thinking about how to tell you." He looked at her directly. The fiddle was in the upper register now, clean and bright. "Tell me." "The co-registration requires both parties to appear in person at the Helena Land Office before February 15th, with documentation of shared intent, which they define as evidence of planned cohabitation or established domestic partnership." She paused. "The straightforward interpretation is marriage. There's a secondary provision for business partnership, but the land office reviewer noted in his reply that this provision has rarely been approved for homestead claims. The marriage route is the reliable one." Jessie was quiet. They turned through a full rotation. "Is that a problem?" he said finally. His voice was careful, not guarded, just precise, asking what he actually wanted to know. "I don't know yet," Maeve said. "That's the honest answer. I told you at the cedar tree what I'm not looking for. I've been watching what comes after the saying like you told me to." She looked at him steadily. "What I've seen so far, the shaft, the desks, tonight that's consistent with what you told me. But," he said. "There's no but," she said. "I'm still watching. We have time before February." She paused. "I wanted you to know I'd written and what they said, because it's your land and your decision as much as mine." Jessie nodded. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then looked over her shoulder at the room, at the storm lamps, at the couples turning through the amber light. "All right," he said. "We watch and we decide when we decide." "Yes," she said. The waltz ended. They came apart, naturally, a proper distance, and she thanked him the way you thank a dance partner, and he inclined his head the way you accept it. Around them, the floor reshuffled for the next song, something faster and less formal, and people were laughing, and the food table was under considerable assault. Sterling was no longer at the wall. Maeve noticed his absence. So did Jessie, a moment later. They both looked toward the door. "He left early," Jessie said. "He doesn't leave early," Maeve said. They stood for a moment thinking about that. Thomas found them at the edge of the floor with cornbread in each hand, and enough energy stored up from an hour of socializing, with boys his own age, that he was practically vibrating. He told them, in rapid and only partially sequential order, about the two boys he'd met, one of whose father worked the freight dock, and one of whose older brother had been in Shaft 4 during the collapse, and how the second boy had told Thomas that his brother said Jessie had set the timber brace in under 10 minutes, which Thomas now wanted confirmed. "It was longer than 10 minutes, Jessie said. "How much longer?" "Considerably." Thomas looked slightly deflated. "How considerably?" "Long enough to do it right," Jessie said. Thomas thought about this and apparently found it acceptable. He went back to the food table. Kitchy appeared at Maeve's elbow. He had been quiet all evening, but his eyes had been tracking everything, and the look he had now was the look he got when he'd processed something and formed a conclusion about it. Spoke to two men near the door. Before he left, Kitchy said. He said it to Maeve, then looked at Jessie. "I didn't know them. They weren't miners. They had the wrong hands for it." Jessie looked at him. "What do you mean, wrong hands? Miners have cuts and coal grit and broken nails." Kitchy said. "These men had clean hands, but rough at the knuckles and the palms. Different kind of rough." He paused. "Like yours." Jessie and Maeve looked at each other. "Could you describe them?" Jessie said. Kitchy described them. Precisely, without embellishment. Height, build, coat color, hat style. The way one of them stood with his weight on his left foot. The way the other kept his right hand near his belt. It was an accurate and detailed accounting from a boy who had spent years learning to read strangers fast because the cost of reading them wrong is high. Jessie listened to every word. "You've got a good eye," he said, when Kitchy finished. "It's useful," Kitchy said simply. Jessie looked at the door where Sterling had exited. His expression was calm, but it was the kind of calm that means the calculations behind it are moving at speed. "We should go," he said to Maeve. Not urgent, but soon. Arthur, she said immediately. Yes. They collected Thomas from the food table and Kitchy from the wall, and moved toward the door with the unhurried pace of a family that had simply had enough of the evening. Maeve said her goodbyes to the women near the food table. Brief, warm, normal. Jessie nodded to Cal, who was near the door, and Cal nodded back with the particular gravity of a man who has been underground with you and will not forget it. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the storm from 2 weeks ago long gone, and the sky above Oak Haven a hard, brilliant black, with more stars than the smoke usually allowed. The street was mostly empty. The freight depot's amber light spilled across the boards behind them. Maeve walked fast. Jessie kept pace. Thomas walked between them with his cornbread, sensing the change in register without being told about it, and said nothing. Kitchy walked just behind and watched the street. The post office was dark and locked as she'd left it. The parlor window at the back showed lamplight, Arthur's reading lamp, still on. She unlocked the door and went straight through to the parlor. Arthur looked up from his chair with the newspaper in his lap, and he was fine, and she exhaled. Enjoyable evening? Arthur said. Educational, Maeve said. Arthur looked past her at Jessie, who had come as far as the parlor doorway. The old man's eyes were sharp, even when the rest of him was not. He'd assessed Jessie in the first 2 days of his stay with the particular thoroughness of a father operating on limited time and wanting to be efficient about it. Trouble? Arthur said. Possibly building toward it, Jessie said. He said it straight, which was the right call. Arthur Thornton had survived 4 years of a war and 20 years of a coal town, and he had no patience for information managed for his comfort. Arthur nodded. Then you'd better think carefully tonight, he said. Sterling moves fast when he thinks he's losing ground. I know, Jessie said. We will. He went upstairs. Maeve sat with her father for a while, talking about nothing in particular. The evening, who'd been at the auction, how much the copperware had gone for. Arthur listened and responded, and didn't push on the things she wasn't saying, which she appreciated. Eventually, his eyes grew heavy, and she took the newspaper out of his lap and turned down the lamp. She stood at the parlor window for a while after he was asleep. The street was quiet. The stars were out. Somewhere at the south end of town, the mine complex ran its night operations, and the coal smoke rose against the starfield in slow, dark columns. She thought about the dance floor, and the bank drafts, and the waltz, and what Jessie had said. She thought about Kitchy describing 2 men with clean hands and the wrong kind of rough at the palms. She thought about Sterling leaving early. Then she went to her desk and lit her own lamp and opened the land office reply letter and read it again. From the beginning, more slowly this time, looking for provisions and clauses and secondary interpretations she might have missed. She found 2. She wrote them down in her ledger margin, in her precise, careful hand, and sat looking at them for a long time. Above her, through the loft ceiling, she could hear Jessie moving the creak of the cot, the small sound of the stove being fed one more piece of wood against the cold. Still here, those sounds said. Still working. She closed the ledger, blew out the lamp, went to bed. The storm lamps in the freight depot would burn down to nothing by midnight, and in the morning Oak Haven would be the same coal town it always was. Smoke and debt and the long, cold coming. But in the freight ledger at Dix's podium, next to the alley lease line item, the name McCoy sat in black ink, and that was a fact. And facts in the record have a staying power that speeches and threats and walking sticks do not. Maeve knew that. She fell asleep thinking about it. The blizzard arrived 3 days after the harvest auction. It came from the northwest the way real Wyoming winter does not gradually, not with much warning, but as a declaration. 1 hour, the sky was the flat white of an overcast afternoon. The next, it was moving. By nightfall, the wind was driving snow horizontal down Oak Haven's Main Street, piling it against the storefronts, burying the boardwalk edges, turning the coal smoke into something that mixed with the white and made the air a gray-white wall you couldn't see 30 feet through. The post office closed at noon. Maeve had sent Thomas and Kitchy home before the worst of it arrived, making them take the extra wool blankets she kept folded on the storeroom shelf. She'd argued briefly with Thomas about whether he needed them. He'd taken them without admitting he did, which was close enough. Arthur was in the parlor with the stove banked high, his newspaper and his tea, drifting in and out of sleep the way he did on the bad cough days. Maeve kept the connecting door cracked so she could hear him. Jessie was in the loft, working through correspondence. She could hear him up there, the occasional sound of papers, the slow creak of the floorboards when he shifted his weight. Those sounds had become over 3 weeks, something she'd stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a clock that keeps good time. It was simply part of the building's normal rhythm now. The knock came at 9:30 in the evening, not the front door. The side door, the one that opened from the post office back room onto the alley. 3 knocks, deliberate and official sounding, and then without waiting for an answer it opened. 2 men came in first. Then 3 more. They were cold from the street, snow on their hats and coats, and they had the compressed, purposeful look of men who had been given a specific job and were focused on completing it. The first 2 wore deputies' badges, territorial, not county, which was wrong in a way Maeve registered immediately. Territorial deputies had no routine jurisdiction in a county seat without a specific warrant from the circuit court or the territorial marshal's office. Behind them, Judge Sterling. Behind Sterling, 2 more men, the men with the clean hands and the wrong kind of rough at their palms that Kitchy had described at the harvest auction. Sterling was in his traveling coat, the heavy one with the fur collar, and he was carrying a leather document case. His walking stick was in his left hand. He looked, Maeve thought, like a man who had been planning this specific evening for some time and was allowing himself a degree of satisfaction at its arrival. "Miss Thornton," he said, "I apologize for the hour. Official business doesn't wait on weather." "Show me your authorization," Maeve said. She was behind the counter, and she stayed there, and her voice was the same voice she used for postal rate disputes, even unimpressed, requiring documentation. One of the deputies produced a paper and laid it on the counter. She picked it up. It was a territorial warrant, signed by a circuit court judge she recognized by name, a man known to have ruled favorably in 4 previous cases involving Sterling's syndicate. The warrant named Jesse McCoy as a suspect in the murder of one Clayton Voss, cattle baron, Bexar County, Texas, 3 years prior. It authorized detention and a summary hearing pending transfer to territorial custody. Her eyes moved through it twice. "Jesse McCoy," Sterling said, and raised his voice toward the ceiling, toward the loft stairs. "By authority of the Wyoming Territorial Court, you are hereby required to present yourself for lawful detention." Silence from above for a moment. Then footsteps on the loft stairs, unhurried. Jesse came down into the post office with his coat on and his hat in his hand. The way a man comes into a room where he knew something was going to happen and has had just enough time to decide how he is going to stand in it. He looked at the deputies. He looked at Sterling. He looked at the document in Maeve's hand. "Let me see it," he said. She handed it across the counter. He read it standing there, taking his time. His face gave nothing. He handed it back. "This warrant is issued out of circuit court," he said to the deputies, not to Sterling. "For execution in a county seat, it requires the county sheriff's countersignature or the presence of the county sheriff himself. Is he here?" The deputies looked at each other. "The county sheriff," Sterling said smoothly, "is currently indisposed by the storm. These deputies are authorized to act in his absence under emergency provisions." "Under emergency provisions," Jesse said, "that require documentation separate from this warrant." "The documentation exists," Sterling said. "It will be produced at the hearing." Jesse looked at the deputies again. One of them had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. The other one was watching Sterling. That told Jesse what he needed to know about who was running this proceeding. He looked at Maeve. Just a look, brief and direct, and in it she read the same thing she'd been reading since the bore at Shaft 4. He was assessing the situation, honestly, not minimizing it. This was real. The warrant was real. The men were real. And right now, they had the numbers and the paper and the weather. "All right," Jesse said. He held up his hands slightly, a cooperative gesture, unhurried. "Where are you taking me?" "The saloon has a back room secured for temporary detention," Sterling said. "The hearing will be conducted tonight." "Tonight," Maeve said, "in a saloon. Emergency provisions allow for expedient proceedings when transfer to a formal facility is impractical," Sterling said. He looked at her with the particular patience of a man who is enjoying the moment and wants it to last. "You're welcome to attend, Miss Thornton, as a witness to the fairness of the proceedings." He said fairness the way a man says a word he knows is not accurate, but cannot be challenged in the moment. Jesse went with the deputies without being pulled. He put on his hat and walked out the side door and into the blizzard, and the wind swallowed the sound of his footsteps inside of 5 seconds. Maeve stood at the counter with the warrant copy in her hand. Sterling paused at the door. "A word of counsel," he said. "McCoy is not a simple man to know. Men who take on other men's legal troubles have their own reasons for doing so, and those reasons are not always what they present them as." He let that sit. "By morning, this will be resolved, one way or another." He left. The side door swung shut, and the blizzard came through the gap for a moment, cold and total, before the latch caught. Maeve stood very still. Then she moved. She went upstairs first to the loft, and found what she was looking for in Jesse's deed papers, the land office correspondence, the Montana bank drafts, the letters in the territorial archive format, with their case numbers and registration stamps. She was looking for anything that placed Jesse in Montana in the 3-year window around the Texas murder date, any official document that showed location or activity in a different territory at a relevant time. There were 3 letters, one from 18 months ago, one from 2 years ago, and one from 2.5 years ago. None of them precisely bracketed the murder date on the warrant, which Sterling had been careful to make vague. "Circa 3 years prior" was the language, which could mean 2.5 or could mean 3.5, depending on how you argued the calendar. Sterling's lawyers, she understood, would argue it however they needed to. She took the letters anyway. She took the bank draft documentation and the land office deed registry page and the letter from the Helena land office regarding the co-registration. She folded everything into a leather document case, her own, the one she used for postal inspection correspondence, and went back downstairs. She looked at the telegraph machine on the counter. The telegraph line ran south from Oak Haven to the county seat and east to the regional hub at Laramie, from which connections went in every direction across the territory and beyond. The line was old, and the insulation on the high-pass sections was patched in 3 places she knew about, which meant in a blizzard of this severity, the line might or might not be carrying signal. There was one way to find out. She sat down at the key. She sent a test signal south first, a simple code tap requesting acknowledgement. She waited. The wind hit the north wall. The stove ticked. She waited. The acknowledgement came back, faint but real. The line was up. She exhaled. She started working. The first wire went to the county sheriff's office at the county seat, formally requesting verification of the emergency deputy authorization referenced in the warrant. She worded it precisely, with the warrant's reference numbers and the names of the issuing deputies, the way she'd learned to word official correspondence specific, documented, unanswerable, without a direct response. The second wire was harder to compose and took her 3 attempts before she had the language right. It went to the Southern Judicial Registry at Cheyenne, the Territorial Court's official record office, requesting any filed documentation on the case of Voss, Clayton deceased, Bixar County, Texas, specifically any records of hearing, ruling, or dismissal related to the incident in question. She didn't know if records existed. She didn't know if the registry office would have anyone at the key at this hour during a blizzard. She didn't know if the line would hold long enough for a reply. She sent it anyway. Then she put on her heaviest coat, tucked the document case under her arm, checked on Arthur, still asleep, still breathing, the stove still holding, and went out into the blizzard. The main street was nearly impassable. The wind was the problem more than the depth the snow had drifted to her knee in some sections, and blown clear to bare board in others, and she had to lean into each gust and pick her footing carefully. The lamp posts were burning, but their light barely reached the ground through the driven snow. She could see the saloon's windows from half a block away, amber and crowded. She pushed the door open and went in. The room was full, not with the ordinary saloon crowd, with half the town, it seemed, packed in against the weather, miners and merchants, and the ladies' auxiliary women who'd been at the harvest auction, and various others who had either been drinking here when the deputies arrived or had heard something moving through the storm network of neighbor, telling neighbor, and had come to see. The back area of the saloon, usually separated from the main room by a heavy curtain, had been opened up. Someone had brought in chairs and arranged them in rough rows facing the bar, which Sterling had apparently designated as the judicial bench. He stood behind it with his walking stick and his document case, and the particular posture of a man who has arranged the room to match his sense of himself. The two territorial deputies stood on either side of the bar. Jesse was in a chair facing the bar, his hands rested on his knees. Not bound, which was technically in compliance with territorial detention rules for a preliminary hearing, but the two men with the wrong kind of rude hands stood directly behind his chair, and that compliance felt narrow. Maeve came down the center of the room. People moved for her. She reached the front and stood between the rows of chairs and the bar and looked at Sterling. "This proceeding," she said, at a volume the whole room could hear, "has not followed lawful warrant execution procedure. The county sheriff has not countersigned this warrant or authorized these deputies in writing. I've sent a formal request for confirmation to the county seat and am awaiting reply." Sterling looked at her with the expression of a man who has anticipated this move and has decided it doesn't matter. "The emergency provisions, I've read the emergency provisions," Maeve said. "They require a documented declaration of emergency signed by two elected officials of the relevant jurisdiction. I'd like to see that documentation." A murmur moved through the room. Sterling set his walking stick down against the bar. He opened his document case. He produced a paper and held it out to one of the deputies, who carried it to Maeve. It was a declaration of emergency, signed by two names. One was the territorial magistrate, Sterling's own judicial title. The other was the coal company's administrative director, a man named Pruitt, who had never held an elected office in his life. "A magistrate cannot sign his own emergency authorization," Maeve said. "That's a conflict of interest by definition. And Pruitt is a corporate administrator, not an elected official. This declaration is invalid on both signatures." More murmuring, louder now. Sterling let it run for a moment, then he held up one hand, and his voice came down on the room with the weight of a man who has practiced authority for 30 years. "We are not in a federal courtroom, Miss Thornton. This is an expedient preliminary hearing under emergency conditions, and procedural refinements will be addressed in formal proceedings. Tonight, we are establishing the basic facts of the case." He turned to Jesse. "Mr. McCoy." He opened his document case again and produced a revolver, which he set on the bar in front of him, and then a printed document, which he set beside it. "This firearm was found in your saddlebags by Deputy Crane during a lawful search, pursuant to the warrant. It is a Colt single-action Army revolver, serial number partially obscured, with an engraving on the backstrap." He turned the revolver so the room could see it. The engraved name on the metal, catching the saloon's lamplight. "Clayton Voss, the name of the murdered man. He paused. Voss was killed in Bexar County, Texas, 3 years ago. Multiple witnesses placed a tall man matching your description at the scene. You were in Texas 3 years ago, Mr. McCoy. Were you not? Jesse said nothing. The room waited. Mr. McCoy, Sterling said, the question is simple. Jesse looked at the revolver on the bar. His expression was the same as it had been in the bore at Shaft 4, when he'd looked at the stressed timber frames, reading it, measuring it, calculating what was actually there and what it would bear. He looked up at Sterling. I have nothing to say at this proceeding. Your silence, my silence, Jesse said, is my legal right. A man cannot be compelled to testify against himself in a criminal matter, preliminary or otherwise. That right exists in territorial law, it exists in federal law, it exists in the basic framework of justice that your court is supposed to represent. His voice was level, unhurried, addressing the room as much as Sterling. I'll answer for what I've done in front of a proper court, with proper procedure, with the right to call witnesses and to face my accuser directly. That's not obstruction. That's the law. The room was very quiet. Then one of the miners in the third row said, not loudly, but clearly enough, he's right. Sterling's expression moved, just slightly. Sterling looked at the revolver, then at Jesse's hands, which were resting on his knees, and specifically at the right hand, and the old scar along the palm, thick and pale, running from the base of the thumb toward the wrist. The recoil mark from a heavy hammer colt, Sterling said, leaves a distinctive scar on the firing hand, specifically on the heel of the palm, when the hammer is cocked and the pistol fired at close range, in a grip that is not fully controlled. He looked at the room. Mr. McCoy has such a scar. I invite those present to observe. Every eye in the room went to Jesse's right hand. Jesse did not close it. He did not hide it or move it. He let them look, which was either the response of a man with nothing to hide or the response of a man who has decided that concealment is a worse position than exposure and is choosing his ground carefully. Maeve saw the scar. She'd noticed it before in the gallery at Shaft 4 when she'd watched his hands on the timber braces. She'd assumed it was a rope scar or a tool injury. She looked at it now with a different understanding. And she felt the room feel it too, the collective shift of a crowd that has just seen a piece of evidence and is beginning to make a verdict from it. Sterling let the silence work. Then he picked up his walking stick and brought it down on the bar in a single sharp crack, and his voice came out like a man who has been patient long enough and now believes the ground is fully his. Jesse McCoy, you stand convicted of capital murder, to hang by the neck at sunrise. The crack of the words hit the room like the bell that morning at Shaft. 4, the wrong rhythm, the wrong pattern, the sound of something going badly. 2 of the deputies moved toward Jesse. Jesse stood. He didn't resist. He turned once to look at Maeve, and his face had the same quality it had when he'd held her gaze in the post office, while the deputies filed in honest, direct, not asking her to fix it, just making sure she saw it clearly. She saw it. The deputies took him through the back room of the saloon, where she could hear the sound of a cellar door, and then boots on wooden stairs descending, and then the door closing. The room remained very still for a moment after. Sterling was putting documents back into his leather case with deliberate satisfaction, the careful motions of a man replacing tools after a completed job. Maeve stood in the front of the room with her document case under her arm and the warrant copy in her hand and the knowledge of what she'd seen on Jesse's face. And she was building something in her mind. Not an argument. A sequence. Point to point to point. The way you work through a postal ledger or a land office filing, following each entry to the next, looking for where the record proves itself true or false. The scar proved Jesse had fired a Colt at close range at some point in his life. That was all it proved. A scar on a palm is not a confession. An engraved revolver is not a sworn testimony. An emergency hearing in a saloon at midnight during a blizzard, authorized by a magistrate's self-signed document, is not a trial. Sterling closed his document case and looked at her from across the bar. "Go home, Miss Thornton," he said, not unkindly, which was worse than if he'd said it hard. "There's nothing for you to do here tonight." Maeve looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back through the saloon, through the crowd of people who parted for her, and out into the blizzard. She did not go home. She went back to the telegraph. The post office was cold. She'd been gone 40 minutes, and the front room stove had dropped. She built it back up with 2 pieces of wood and sat down at the key without taking her coat off. The line was still up. She could feel it in the faint hum of the instrument, the current still running through the storm. She sent another wire south, this one to the Texas Judicial Circuit, Bexar County specifically, their court records office, their clerk of criminal proceedings. She asked for the complete case file on Clayton, deceased, with specific attention to any findings of justifiable homicide, any dismissed charges, any witness testimony regarding third-party protection or self-defense. Then she waited. The wind screamed at the north wall. The stove ticked and cracked and built its heat. The telegraph key sat on the counter in the lamplight, and Maeve sat in front of it, with her hands folded, and her eyes on it, and her mind moving through the saloon scene, point by point. Jessie had said nothing. Not from guilt, and not from fear. She was certain of that, with the same certainty she had about the validity of Sterling's emergency declaration. It was a conclusion reached through evidence and logic, not through preference. A man who committed murder in a rage or for gain does not stand in a saloon full of people with his scarred palm visible and say calmly that his legal rights require a proper proceeding. That man hides his hand. That man argues innocence. That man does something with the space between accusation and verdict. Jessie had stood in it. There was something he was protecting. Someone. More than one, someone probably. And whatever it was had made him decide, in the moment when speaking would have helped him, and silence would hurt him, to be silent. She thought about the immigrant laborers Sterling had squeezed out of other counties through his railroad land seizures. She thought about the families that moved through the territory, looking for places where the law's reach was slightly shorter than their suffering. She thought about what Kitschy had told her once about traveling, that the most dangerous moment was when someone with authority looked at you and decided you were worth chasing. She thought about Jessie riding out of Texas and into Montana and building a house and putting in a horse pasture and a barn and a kitchen garden and waiting, and filing a deed and working the land, and sending letters to a girl he'd carved his initials next to 20 years ago. A man with a guilty conscience does not build things meant to last. She was still sitting there, still thinking, when the telegraph key moved. She was on it before the first tone finished. The reply from Bexar County came through, in pieces, the storm interrupting and then resuming, so that she had to work the decoder at speed and fill in the gaps from context. Her hand on the paper was precise and fast. The words came. Voss, Clayton case file 1,885 charge, murder status, dismissed grounds, justifiable homicide in defense of third parties, ruling by Judge Harlan T. Cross December 1,885 defendant identified as J. McCoyd, Montana Territory full self-defense, finding on record. No outstanding warrant in Texas jurisdiction repeat. No outstanding warrant. She read it twice. Then she picked up her pen and wrote the decoded message, out clean on a fresh piece of paper, reading it a third time as she wrote to make sure she had every word. Dismissed. Justifiable homicide. Self-defense. No outstanding warrant. Sterling's sealed indictment was built on a case that had already been resolved in a Texas court. Jessie had been charged, heard, and cleared 3 years ago. The revolver, the scar, the witness accounts, they'd all been brought before a proper judge in a proper proceeding. And the proper judge had found that Jessie McCoyd had killed Clayton Voss while protecting unarmed farmhands from a ranch sweep that would have killed them. And then, apparently, Jesse had said nothing about it, had let himself carry the weight of it without correction. Because producing the court record would have required producing his name in connection with the location and the event, and the families he'd helped escape that ranch were still out there, still moving, still in the territory. And Sterling, who had railroad syndicate connections stretching across 4 territories, was exactly the kind of man who could find them if the trail was made clear enough. Jesse had stayed silent to keep the trail unclear for 3 years, and again tonight. Maeve sat with the decoded wire in her hands for a long moment. Then she put on her coat, picked up the wire and the document case, and walked back out into the blizzard. The blizzard did not care about urgency. It pushed back against Maeve, the whole 2 blocks between the post office and the saloon, the wind finding every gap in her coat collar, driving snow into her face with the flat indifference of weather that has no opinion about human problems. She kept her head down and her document case tucked under her arm and moved through it. The saloon was still lit, still occupied. She could see it from half a block out, the amber windows blurred behind the blowing snow, and she could hear the low sound of voices even through the storm. People hadn't left. That was something. A crowd is harder to manage than a room with 3 men and a gavel. She pushed the door open. The room turned toward her the way it had before, but different now. Before, people had watched her with the uncertain attention of a crowd that didn't know what it was witnessing. Now there was something more focused in it. They'd been sitting with what they'd seen for the past hour, Sterling's performance, Jesse's silence, the scar, the verdict, delivered over a saloon bar like a cattle auction result, and the sitting had done something to the room's temperature that had nothing to do with the stoves. Sterling was still at the bar. His document case was closed, his walking stick in hand, and he was speaking in a low voice to one of the clean-handed men. He saw Maeve come in, and his expression moved through something very brief before settling back into its customary composure. She walked straight to the front. She set the document case on the nearest table, opened it, and took out the decoded telegraph wire and the second confirmation page she'd written out clean. She held them up. "I have a certified wire dispatch from the Bexar County Court Records Office in Texas," she said. She said it to the room, not just to Sterling, because the room was the point. Decoded and transcribed from the telegraph line 40 minutes ago. It is a certified record of the disposition of the criminal case against Jesse McCoy in the matter of Clayton Voss, Bexar County, 1,885. The room was very still. Sterling's voice came measured and controlled. A telegraph transcription is not a certified legal document and carries no standing in a telegraph dispatch from a court records office referencing a case file number and signed by a clerk of court is admissible as preliminary evidence in any territorial proceeding under Section 14 of the Wyoming Territorial Evidence Code, Maeve said, which you know, Judge Sterling, because you cited that same section yourself in the Hartley property dispute 2 years ago to admit a Cheyenne bank wire as evidence. She looked at him steadily. "I have a very good memory for precedent." Silence. She looked at the dispatch in her hand and read from it, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet room. Case of Voss, Clayton, deceased. Charge, murder. Status, dismissed. Grounds, justifiable homicide in defense of third parties. Ruling by Judge Harlan T. Cross, December 1885. Defendant identified as J. McCoy, Montana Territory. Full self-defense finding on record. No outstanding warrant in Texas jurisdiction. She lowered the page. There is no outstanding warrant. There has not been one for 3 years. The case was heard in a proper court with proper procedure and was dismissed on the grounds that Jesse McCoy acted in self-defense to protect unarmed workers from harm. The murmuring that moved through the room this time was different from the earlier ones. This one had weight in it. Sterling stepped out from behind the bar. He moved onto the floor into the space between Maeve and the crowd, and his voice took on the particular authority he used when he needed a room to remember who held the local power. A dismissal in a Texas jurisdiction has no bearing on a Wyoming territorial warrant. The warrant before us tonight was issued by this court on the basis of a sealed indictment, Maeve said, that you brought forward without disclosing the existing case record, which you knew about. She let that land for a moment. The Texas case was 3 years old and publicly filed. A judge issuing a murder warrant is required to review existing judicial records in other jurisdictions before signing. If that review was done, the Texas dismissal would have appeared in the search, and the warrant could not have been legally issued. Which means either the review was not done, which is a procedural violation, and the record was deliberately not disclosed, which is a much more serious matter. Sterling's face had done something that Maeve had never seen it do before in any of their exchanges. It had gone still, not in the controlled way he managed his expressions, but in the way a structure goes still when something load-bearing inside it has shifted. He recovered quickly. He was good at that. You are operating well outside your expertise and your authority, he said. His voice was quiet now, which was more dangerous than when it was loud, and the room felt the change. A postmistress reading telegraph wire in the middle of the night is not a lawyer and is not an officer of the court. And this display, however theatrically managed, does not constitute a legal proceeding. No, Maeve said. It doesn't. She held the dispatch up again. This does. A documented court record from a jurisdiction with full standing on this case supersedes a warrant issued without proper jurisdictional review. Jesse McCoy was tried and cleared. The revolver, the scar, the Texas witnesses, they were all presented and evaluated by a sitting judge 3 years ago. What you've done tonight is bring a dead case back to life without disclosing that it was already dead. She looked at the room. That is not procedure. That is fabrication. And everyone in this room has now witnessed the documentation proving it. One of the territorial deputies, the one who had looked uncomfortable earlier, stepped forward from his position beside the bar. He was a young man, not much past 25, with a decent face under the official bearing. "Ma'am," he said, "can I see that wire?" Sterling's head turned toward him very slightly. The deputy looked at Sterling and then looked back at Maeve, and the looking back was the decision. Visible and public. She handed him the dispatch. He read it, moving his lips slightly on the case reference numbers. Then he read the key lines again. He handed it to the other deputy, who read it and handed it back. The first deputy looked at Sterling. "Judge Sterling, if this record is accurate, the warrant can't stand. A dismissed case in any jurisdiction, self-defense ruling confirmed by a sitting judge, that's not a basis for a new capital charge without new evidence specific to Wyoming territory. The warrant," Sterling said carefully, "was issued by the circuit court on the evidence presented to that court. Then the circuit court didn't have the full record," the deputy said. He was finding the words as he went. Not a practiced speech, just a man working through something in public, because he'd been handed the evidence and couldn't unfind it. That's not McCoy's fault, and it's not a crime he can be held for. He looked at Maeve. The prisoner should be released pending review. "Pending review is not release," Sterling said sharply. "No," the deputy said, "but keeping a man in a cellar on a warrant that's built on incomplete information isn't legal detention either." He looked at his counterpart. The other deputy nodded. One short motion. Sterling was very still. Around the room, in the rows of chairs and along the back wall, and at the bar itself, the crowd of miners and merchants and women from the auxiliary and night shift workers and anyone else the blizzard had pushed into the saloon was watching all of this with the focus of people who have been shown something they needed to see and are deciding what it means. Cal, the mine foreman, was in the third row. He'd been there since before Maeve arrived. He stood up now, unhurried, and looked at Sterling. I've got 11 men who came home to their families 2 weeks ago because Jesse McQuoid went into that bore, he said. Whatever this document business is, that's a fact that doesn't change. Sterling looked at him. Cal sat back down. Sterling picked up his walking stick. His face had rebuilt itself into composure, the controlled surface that had served him for 30 years in courts and town halls and mine offices. He looked at Maeve. He looked at the dispatch in her hand. He looked at the room. The wire will be reviewed by my office, he said. If the record is as stated, the matter will be addressed through proper channels. Tonight's proceeding is adjourned. He turned to the deputies. Release the prisoner into recognizance. He is not to leave the county pending review. He walked out. The room exhaled. The deputies went through the back room, opened the cellar door, and brought Jesse up. He came into the saloon looking the same as he had going down into it, coat on, hat in hand. His eyes found Maeve immediately, and he crossed the floor to her while the room moved around him. People clapping him briefly on the shoulder, miners he'd worked with in the shaft, men whose names he barely knew, but who reached out anyway. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the dispatch in her hand, and then at her face. Bexar County, she said. He looked at the dispatch for a moment. Something moved across his expression. Not relief exactly, but the particular release of a weight that has been carried for a long time and is finally set down somewhere safe. How long did it take, he said, for the wire to come back? About an hour from the time I sent it. She paused. How long have you been carrying the case? Record yourself without using it. He was quiet for a moment. 3 years, he said. Give or take. Because of the farmhands. He looked at her directly. The families that got out of that ranch went north and east and scattered. 3 of them are still in the territory. If Sterling had the case file, he had names, dates, location. He could trace the path. He paused. I wasn't willing to be the reason those families got found. I know, she said. I worked that out. She held the dispatch up between them. This wire says what happened and who you are and nothing else. The farmhands are not named. The families are not traceable through this record. She had been careful about that, precise in what she'd asked for from the Bexar clerk, precise in what she'd read aloud. You can stop carrying it. He looked at the dispatch. He looked at her. He nodded once, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man accepting something he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve to accept. The saloon was emptying gradually. People moving out into the blizzard in pairs and groups, the energy of the evening dissipating into the cold. The storm lamps were burning lower. The deputies had gone. The 2 clean-handed men had gone with Sterling. Only a few people remained Cal by the door. A couple of miners finishing their drinks, the barman moving around with a cloth. Jesse looked at the room. He's not done, he said. Low and direct. Just for Maeve. No, she said. He's not. Tonight bought time. It didn't buy resolution. I know. She folded the dispatch and put it in her document case. He's going to come at us differently now. He can't use the Texas case anymore. He'll find another pressure point. Jesse turned his hat in his hands. The deed contest. He'll move the timeline up, try to force a resolution on the land before we can produce the co-registration documentation. If the Bitterroot claim reverts to the territory before February, the Railroad Commission can file an acquisition claim on it. Sterling has railroad connections. The land goes to them. Then we move. Faster, Maeve said. He looked at her. The letter from Helena, she said. The co-registration documentation. I know what we need, and I know where to get it. If we can produce the partnership papers before the land office closes its review window, the deed contest becomes much harder for Sterling to leverage. She held his gaze. I've been watching what comes after the saying. 3 weeks of it. Jesse was still in, he said. And I'd like to go to Montana, she said. With you? When the spring routes open, if not before. She said it the way she said most things, directly having made the decision, and not wanting to spend unnecessary time arriving at the saying of it. We have time to do this correctly, with proper documentation and proper procedure. and both our names on the deed in a way that can't be contested by Sterling or anyone else. She paused. But I want it said plainly between us first, before lawyers and land offices. Equal partnership, equal standing on the land. The school is mine to build and run. The ranch decisions are made together. Yes, Jesse said. No deliberation. He'd deliberated before he rode south. The riding south was already the decision. And my father comes, she said. And Kitchy and Thomas. I know, he said. I told you that at the cedar tree. You told me a lot of things at the cedar tree, she said. I've been verifying them one at a time. The corner of his mouth moved. How many left to verify? Fewer than there were, she said. Cal appeared at Jesse's shoulder. He looked at both of them with the quiet regard of a man who has seen enough of people under pressure to know what he's looking at. He put out his hand to Jesse. Jesse shook it. Whatever you need, Cal said. From me or from the mine crew. You've got it. He went out into the blizzard. Jesse and Maeve were left in the near-empty saloon, the storm lamps burning low overhead, the sound of the blizzard working steadily at the walls. Your father, Jesse said. Does he know about the co-registration plan? He knows I wrote to Helena, she said. He didn't ask what I was going to do with the reply. That's his way of telling me he trusts the conclusion I come to. I'd like to speak with him myself, Jesse said. Properly. Not about permission. He doesn't owe me that, and I'm not asking for it. He looked at her steadily. I'd like him to know who he's trusting his daughter to from me. Directly. Whatever questions he has. Maeve looked at him for a moment. He'll ask hard ones. I know. He won't be satisfied with the comfortable answers. Good, Jesse said. I don't have many comfortable answers. I've mostly got the plain ones. He'll like that, she said. They walked out together into the blizzard. The post office was warm when they got back. Maeve had banked the front stove well before leaving, and the residual heat had held. Arthur's lamp was still on in the parlor, which meant he was awake, which meant the noise of the storm had gotten into his sleep, and he hadn't been able to settle. Maeve checked the telegraph key first. 2 more responses had come in during the hour she'd been gone. The county sheriff's office had finally replied to her first wire, confirming that no emergency deputy authorization had been signed by the sheriff's office and that the deputies present at tonight's proceeding were operating outside their sanctioned scope. The second wire was from the territorial marshal's office at Cheyenne, acknowledging receipt of her inquiry about the warrant and flagging it for Monday morning review. She wrote both down, added them to the document case with the Bexar County Dispatch and the invalidity notes on Sterling's emergency declaration. Paper, her father had told her when she was small. Always get it on paper. An agreement spoken in a room vanishes with the room. An agreement in a ledger stays until someone burns the ledger, and burning ledgers is a crime that leaves smoke. She put the document case on the shelf behind the postal counter, next to the ledger she'd kept for 3 years on Sterling's tax assessment manipulations. Jesse stood at the front room stove, warming his hands. The blizzard was still at the walls, but inside it was quiet and warm, and the lamps were steady. The farmhands, Maeve said. She was at the counter, not looking at him, arranging the papers, at the Voss ranch. What was the sweep? Jesse was quiet for a moment. Voss had decided the workers on his spread were organizing, he said. He brought in men to clear them off the land. Not legally. No notices. No courts. Just men and horses and instructions to make the situation resolved before morning. He paused. I was passing through, working a trail drive south. I saw what was happening, and I made a decision. You put yourself between them and Voss. Voss pulled first, Jesse said. I was faster. He looked at his right hand, at the scar on the palm. The hammer recoil mark is from the shot. I wasn't expecting the force of it. He turned his hand over and back. The families got out that night. I stayed to face what came from it. The Texas court heard it straight and ruled straight. He paused. I couldn't let Sterling have the case file, not because of what it said about me, because of what it would have told him about who was where and when. Maeve set the last paper down. You protected them twice, she said. Once that night, and then every day since, when you could have produced the record and didn't. I had land and a roof, Jesse said. They had less. She looked at him across the front room, the postal counter between them, the storm at the walls, the lamps burning steady. She thought about what it costs to make that calculation, to decide that your own safety is worth less than the safety of people you don't know well and will likely never see again, and to make it quietly, without announcement, and then to carry it for 3 years without complaint. She thought about what it says about a man's arithmetic, what he counts as valuable, where he puts the weight. Come and meet my father, she said, properly. Arthur was in his chair, with his newspaper folded in his lap and his tea cold on the side table, which told her he'd been awake and thinking rather than reading. He looked up when they came in, and his eyes did the quick assessment they always did her face first, for how she was, and then Jesse, unhurried, all the way through. Sit down, Arthur said to Jesse. Jesse sat in the chair across from him. Maeve stayed in the doorway. Arthur looked at Jesse for a long moment without speaking. The way old men who have been through serious things look at younger men, they're sizing up, not hostile, not warm yet, just exact. You went into the bore at Shaft 4, Arthur said. Yes, sir. And tonight they locked you in Sterling's cellar on a dead case. Yes, sir. And you said nothing to defend yourself. Jesse was quiet a moment. There were people the defense would have hurt more than the silence. Arthur looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, My daughter is not a woman who needs protecting. I suspect you know that. Yes, sir, Jesse said. What she needs, Arthur said, is someone who won't flinch when she's right. And they're wrong. Who won't decide her work is less important than their own, because his name is on the deed and hers is on the classroom door. He coughed, once a deep rattling sound that he controlled by long practice. He settled. In my experience, that kind of man is considerably rarer than the protecting kind. I know, Jesse said. Are you that kind? Jesse looked at him steadily. I intend to be. I can't prove it in a parlor. I can only prove it over time. Arthur studied him. Then he looked at Maeve in the doorway. Something passed between them, father and daughter. A conversation they'd been having in pieces for weeks without words. Arthur picked up his newspaper. There's tea on the stove if it hasn't gone to nothing, he said. Cold night to stand in doorways. He opened his paper. The conversation was over, and the verdict was in it. In the opening of the newspaper, in the deliberate settling back that said, considered and accepted. Let's get on with it. Jesse looked at Maeve. She tilted her head toward the kitchen. They went and found the tea. After Jesse went upstairs and Arthur's lamp finally went dark, Maeve sat alone at the postal counter with the document case open in front of her and the telegraph key quiet on the counter. She thought about due process, not as an abstract legal principle, but as a living, practical thing, the requirement that evidence be real before conclusions are drawn from it. The requirement that a man be heard before he is condemned. The requirement that the record be complete and, honestly, presented before a verdict is reached. Sterling had violated all of it deliberately. He'd taken a dead case and dressed it in current clothes and presented it in a room set up to look like a court and called the result justice. And if she hadn't gone to the key and sent the wires and waited in the cold for the replies, the room might have believed him. Most of the room would have gone home, and in the morning, Jesse McCoy would have been hanged on a charge that a Texas judge had dismissed 3 years ago. That was not justice. That was power dressed up as procedure, which was the thing that made it dangerous because it used the language of law to do the work of injustice. And that confusion was the whole point. She thought about the miners who'd watched tonight, who'd seen Sterling issue his verdict and then seen her walk in with the telegraph dispatch, who'd seen the deputy read the wire and then stand up to Sterling, not because he was brave in any dramatic sense, but because the evidence was clear. And the law said a clear thing, and he'd followed it. Information, evidence. The record. They don't win every fight, but they change the shape of the fighting. They put the truth in a room and make the people in the room decide what to do with it. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes enough people in the room choose correctly that the truth gets to stay. She closed the document case. She checked the lock on the front door and the side door and the back of the storeroom. Then she went to the storeroom table and lit the lantern and sat down at one of the oak desks, Thomas's desk, the one with the slightly worn edge, where he pressed his forearm and took out a clean piece of paper. She wrote the summary of tonight's proceedings from beginning to end, in plain, clear language, with every document reference, and every name, and every wire message, and every statement from the floor. She wrote it as a formal record of events, the kind that could be submitted to a court or a federal authority, or the territorial governor's office, the kind that stays in a file until someone needs it. She signed and dated it. She put it in the document case. Paper, her father had said. Always get it on paper. Outside, the blizzard was easing. The wind had dropped from a scream to a push, and through the storeroom's small window, she could see that the snow had slowed. The flakes coming down now in the large, soft way. That means the system is spending itself out. By morning, the sky would be clear and cold, and the streets would be buried in white, and Oakhaven would look briefly like a clean place. She blew out the lantern and went to bed. The document case sat on the shelf behind the postal counter, next to the 3-year ledger. Both of them full of the truth, patient and recorded, waiting to be useful. Sterling moved fast, the way Arthur had said he would. 2 days after the saloon hearing, when the blizzard had cleared, and the streets were packed white, and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue that follows a Wyoming storm like an apology, 3 strangers rode into Oakhaven from the south. Not deputies, not company men in syndicate coats. These men wore no identifiable affiliation, which was itself an identification. They took rooms at the hotel on the corner of Main and Freight, paid in cash, and ate their meals quietly, and observed the town with the methodical attention of people who are learning the layout of a place before they do something in it. Kitchie saw them first. He came to the post office the morning after they arrived and told Jesse what he'd observed the same way he'd described Sterling's men at the harvest auction, precise and unembellished, where they'd stood, how they'd moved, the way one of them had walked the alley behind the post office at dusk, slowly, and looked at the building's rear wall and the dry goods storage door. Jesse listened to all of it without interrupting. "Thank you," he said when Kitchie finished. He said it straight, the way he said everything, not with excess, not minimizing. You've got good instincts, and you use them well. That matters. Kitchie nodded once and went to his desk in the storeroom. Jesse went to find Arthur. Arthur was in the parlor, which was his territory for the mornings when the cold was deep. Jesse sat across from him and told him plainly what Kitchie had seen and what he believed it meant. Arthur listened with his eyes on the middle distance, the way veterans listen to situation reports, absorbing without reacting, processing before responding. "He can't use the courts anymore," Arthur said when Jesse finished. "Not cleanly. You've got the Texas record, the invalid warrant, the county sheriff's denial of the emergency authorization. Anyone Sterling puts on the bench to rule against you now has to explain those documents first." He coughed, controlled it, settled. "So he moves to something that doesn't require a bench." "Yes," Jesse said. "The post office records," Arthur said. "The ledger Maves kept on the tax assessments. The document case from the hearing. The telegraph dispatches." He looked at Jesse. "If those disappear, a significant part of your legal standing disappears with them." "And the deed paperwork," Jesse said. "And the letters from Helena. And the Bexar County Wire." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "How much time do you think we have?" "Hours," Jesse said. "Maybe less." Arthur put his hands on the arms of his chair and pushed himself to his feet with the deliberate effort of a man who has made peace with the effort and doesn't let it slow him down. He stood straight. "Then let's not waste it talking." They moved everything that mattered within the hour. Maeve pulled the document case, the ledger, the Helena letters, the telegraph dispatches, and the land office correspondence. She wrapped them in oilcloth and tied it tight. Jessie took the package to Cal's house, 2 blocks west, not the post office, not the livery, Cal's house, because Cal was known to the miners and not yet known to Sterling's men as a connected party. And sometimes the best hiding place is the one that looks like nothing. Cal took the package without ceremony and put it under the floorboard in his back room without asking what was in it. "Anything else?" he said. "Not yet," Jessie said. Back at the post office, Jessie assessed the building. He'd been doing this quietly for 2 weeks, noting the entry points, the sight lines from the windows, the distance to the nearest cover on the street side and the alley side. Not because he'd been expecting this specific morning, but because in his experience, situations that are building toward something tend to build toward it, regardless of whether you're watching. And watching costs nothing. The post office and dry goods store occupied a long, narrow building with the front postal counter facing Main Street and the dry goods storeroom running the full length behind it, accessed from the front room through a connecting door and from the alley through the rear entry. The loft ran above the full length. 2 windows on the front, one on the north side, one small window in the storeroom rear wall. It was defensible. Not ideal, but defensible. Jessie told Thomas and Kitchie to go to Cal's house. He told them directly, no softening, he explained, that men were likely coming to the building to cause damage and that their being inside the building when that happened was not an acceptable outcome. Thomas looked at him with the flat assessment he'd used the first day they'd met. "We could help. You'll help," Jessie said, "by being at Cal's. If something goes wrong here and you're safe there, that's one less thing I have to think about. The less I have to think about, the better I work." He held Thomas's gaze. "That's not dismissing you. That's using you correctly." Thomas considered this for a moment, apparently found the logic sound, and went. Kitchie looked at Jessie before he followed. He held out his hand. Jessie shook it. Then Kitchie went. Arthur refused to go to Cal's house. He said it once, simply, when Maeve raised the subject, and his tone closed the discussion. He was a Union veteran who had held a field position at Cold Harbor for 6 hours with a shoulder wound, and he was not leaving his own post office. He went to the back room and produced a Spencer carbine from behind the flower shelf, checked its action, and began loading it with the calm efficiency of a man for whom this particular skill had never entirely faded. Maeve looked at him. "He might be 61, Arthur said, checking the sight on the carbine, "but this Spencer still shoots straight." "I wasn't going to argue," Maeve said. She went to the front room and came back with 2 more carbines from the locked cabinet behind the postal counter. She'd kept them there since the coal company thugs came through the back door, and she'd cleaned and loaded them the morning after. She set one on the work table. She kept the other. Jessie took stock of the 3 of them and the building and the position and said, "All right, here's how we do this." They came at mid-afternoon. The first sign was the smell. But before she saw or heard anything, Maeve caught it through the storeroom's small rear window, a sharp chemical bite underneath the coal smoke, something that didn't belong. Oil. Lamp oil, but more of it than any lamp required. And it was outside the building, along the rear wall. She went to Jessie at the front room window. Immediately. He was already moving. He went out the front door low and fast, cutting north along the building's face and into the gap between the post office and the hardware store next door. Maeve took her position at the front window. Arthur moved to the storeroom door, where he had a line of sight down the rear entry and the alley. There were 4 of them. Jessie saw them from the gap between buildings, 2 at the rear wall, with the oil cans, one covering the alley entrance, one on the far side of Main Street, watching the front. The one on Main Street was the lookout, and he saw Jessie come around the corner of the building. At the same moment, Jessie saw him. The man pulled. Jessie was already moving sideways, and the shot went into the hardware store's front boards. Jessie came around the north end of the post office at a run and hit the alley at its midpoint, putting the building between himself and the Main Street shooter, which left him in the alley with the man who was covering the rear entry. The covering man had a rifle and the advantage of position. Jesse had the advantage of already being in motion. He took the rifle. Not the rifle, sweeping in under the man's arm as he raised it, and using the forward momentum to strip it and come through with his shoulder into the man's chest, putting him against the alley wall, with enough force to matter, and following it with a controlled strike to the elbow that dropped the arm and the man's ability to swing it. The man went down. Jesse left him there, not unconscious, but no longer in the fight, and came around to the rear of the building. Inside, the first shot hit the post office from the front. It punched through the front window glass and crossed the room and put a hole in the far wall of the front room. And the glass came down in a long crash, and the cold air poured through the opening immediately. Maeve was below the window line, on the floor behind the postal counter, and she came up with the carbine and looked. The Main Street man had moved from his position across the street and was using the freight wagon at the hitching post for cover. She could see him in the gaps between the wagon's slats. He was reloading. She raised the carbine and put a shot through the wagon boards 6 inches left of where he was, which she intended as a boundary marker rather than a hit. She wanted him behind that wagon and focused on the front window, not on moving. He stayed behind the wagon. From the rear of the building, the sound of the back door, not a knock, an impact, someone hitting it with force to break the latch. The door held. Jesse had refitted the latch the week before with a 3-inch iron bar drop bracket, which held against the first impact and the second. The third didn't come because Arthur put a carbine shot through the door's upper panel, not through a person. Through the wood, deliberately high, splintering the panel outward into the alley. The message of it was simple and agricultural. This door is answered. Silence from the alley for a moment. Then, through the shattered front window, from the gap by the freight wagon, the Main Street man called out, "Come out of the building. Come out, and nobody gets hurt." Maeve, behind the postal counter, looked at the holes the first shot had made in her front room wall. She looked at the broken window and the cold air pouring through it. "That ship has sailed," she called back. She fed another round into the carbine. The 2 men with the oil cans were the problem. If they got the oil against the wall and lit it, the building would burn. And burning the building was the point. Burn the records, burn the space, eliminate the evidence and the operation in one act, and let the fire be explicable as an accident in a coal town where fires were not uncommon. Jesse was in the alley between those 2 men and the wall. She knew he was there, but she couldn't see him from inside. What she could do was keep the Main Street man behind his wagon. She stayed below the window line and moved to the north end of the counter, where the angle gave her a slightly different view through the broken window frame. Enough to see the wagon from a new position, enough that if the man shifted his cover, she'd catch the movement. She set the carbine across the counter edge and waited. The man shifted left. She moved the carbine slightly. He stopped shifting. "Good." In the rear, Arthur's voice, conversational. "You'll want to think carefully about your next decision back there." A pause from the alley. "Then, old man, put the rifle down." "I'm considering it," Arthur said pleasantly. "I'm also considering that I held a defensive position for 6 hours at Cold Harbor in '64, with a worse wound than I've currently got and considerably less to fight for. So you'll want to factor that into your thinking." A longer pause. Jesse came through the rear alley from the north end, where the gap between buildings gave him cover from the oil can men's position. He'd circled. He came out behind the nearer of the 2, the one with the can still in his hands, and took him the same way he'd taken the covering man, fast. Controlled, stripping the can and putting the man down without a shot fired, because a shot fired near spilled lamp oil is a different kind of problem. The second oil can man heard it and turned and ran. Jesse didn't chase him. He picked up the dropped oil can and moved it to the center of the alley, away from the building wall and set it down carefully. And then he stood and looked at the alley entrance where the running man had disappeared. From inside, a shout, not aggressive, alarmed. The Main Street man's voice, higher than it had been. "Crane! Crane, they've got Crane!" Crane was apparently the covering man in the alley, now sitting against the wall with a disabled right arm, looking at nothing in particular. Silence from behind the freight wagon. Jesse came back through the alley, checking each corner, and appeared at the post office's north side gap. He looked at the front window. Maeve saw him through the broken frame. He held up one finger, one man left, and pointed at the freight wagon. She nodded. Jesse stepped out onto Main Street. He walked to the center of the street and stood there, which was not a position of cover, which was the whole point of it. He stood in plain sight with his hands visible and looked at the freight wagon. "Come out from behind that wagon," he said. His voice was level and carried in the cold air. "You're the last one standing out here, and you know it. Nothing from behind the wagon." "I'm not going to shoot you," Jesse said. "I haven't shot anyone today, and I'm not starting now. But you need to stand up and put down your firearm and tell me who sent you here, because right now you're the only one in a position to go before a federal authority and testify to what you were hired to do and who hired you." He paused. "That's worth considerably more to you than the alternative." A long silence. Then the man behind the wagon stood up slowly, his hands at shoulder height, his revolver held by two fingers. He was one of the men from the hotel, one of the two that Kitchie had described. He was younger than Maeve had expected, mid-20s, with a face that had done too much of certain things too early, and was already marked by it. Jesse crossed to him and took the revolver. He held it by the barrel and looked at the man. "What's your name?" "Briggs," the man said. He was watching Jesse with the wariness of someone who has been told various things about what happens when you lose a fight and is currently trying to determine which of those things is about to happen. "Briggs," Jesse said, "you came here to burn a building and destroy legal records on behalf of a man who sent you in front instead of coming himself. You understand what that makes you." Briggs didn't say anything. "It makes you the man who faces the federal charge, while the man who hired you sits in his office," Jesse said, "unless you change the arrangement." He held Briggs's gaze. "Federal authorities are going to be in Oakhaven inside of a week. The Territorial Marshal's office acknowledged my wire from 2 nights ago, and they're coming to review the warrant irregularities. When they arrive, you have 2 choices. You can be a man who committed arson and destruction of federal property. A post office is federal property, Briggs with no one to account for why, or you can be a witness who provides a full account of who hired you, what you were told to do, and what you were paid." He paused. "One of those choices has a future in it. The other one doesn't." Briggs looked at the building, at the unburned walls, at the men on the ground in the alley. He looked at Jesse. He said it would be straightforward, Briggs said. "Nobody home at mid-afternoon. Just burn the back and be gone." "He was wrong about who'd be home," Jesse said. "Are you willing to tell that to a federal marshal?" A pause. "Yeah," Briggs said. "Yeah, I'll tell it." Jesse looked at him for a moment longer, confirming something. Then he stepped back and let the man stand freely. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." Maeve had the storeroom ready. By the time Jesse brought Briggs through the front door, the carbine put up, the work table cleared, 2 chairs. She'd assessed Briggs in the 2 seconds it took him to come through the door, and had already decided he was not a dangerous man in any serious sense, just a man who'd been available and had taken a job without thinking carefully about what the job required of him. Arthur emerged from the back with the Spencer over his shoulder and his color slightly high from the exertion, but his breathing even, and his eyes sharp. He looked at Briggs. "Coffee?" he said. Briggs looked like this was not what he'd expected. "Sure," he said. Arthur went to put the coffee on. Maeve looked at Jesse. He had a cut on his left forearm. She could see it through the torn coat sleeve. Not deep, probably from the rifle barrel when he'd stripped it from the covering man. She pointed at it. He looked at it and appeared to find it less significant than she did, which was a point she decided to address. Later, she got the medical kit from the storeroom shelf. Jesse sat down and let her work on his arm, while Briggs sat at the work table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that Arthur had produced with the same placid efficiency he brought to everything. "The man who gave you the job," Maeve said to Briggs, while she cleaned the cut with carbolic and bandaged it. "You know his name, Sterling," Briggs said. He said it with the resignation of a man who has crossed a line and is now on the other side of it and has decided to walk forward rather than back. "Judge Sterling. He contacted us through a freight agent in Laramie. Said it was a records dispute. Said the building was unoccupied mid-afternoons. He looked at the table. He said nobody'd get hurt." "He said that," Maeve said. "Yes, ma'am." She tied off the bandage on Jesse's arm with a clean knot. "And you believe that covering a building in lamp oil was an unoccupied building job." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "I needed the money," he said. It wasn't an excuse, exactly. It was just the plain truth of it, the ordinary human arithmetic that makes people available for things they know are wrong when the pressure is sufficient. Maeve looked at him and chose not to be harsh about it, because harshness was not the point, and accuracy was. "Here's what happens now," she said. "You're going to stay in this building tonight, where I can account for your location. In the morning, we're going to put your account on paper, and you're going to sign it. When the territorial marshal arrives, that signed statement will be ready for him." She looked at Briggs directly. "In exchange, I will tell the marshal that you cooperated from the time of the encounter, that you surrendered your firearm voluntarily, and that you provided your account without compulsion. What happens after that is the marshal's decision, not mine. But your cooperation will be documented, and it will matter." Briggs looked at the signed statement process, the way people look at things they'd rather not do, and have concluded they're going to do anyway. "All right," he said. Arthur set a second cup of coffee on the table without comment. Then he lowered himself into the chair by the stove and looked at the Spencer across his knees and coughed once, controlled and settled. Jesse was looking at Arthur. Maeve saw it the slight shift of his attention toward the old man, assessing. "Papa," she said. "How's the shoulder?" "Fine," Arthur said. "Let me see it." "It's fine, Maeve, Papa." He opened his coat. The left shoulder of his shirt was dark, not soaked, but marked. She crossed the room and pulled the collar aside and looked at it, and her breath went out through her nose in a controlled exhale. A graze. A bullet had come along the alley wall and caught the outer edge of his shoulder at shallow angle, enough to tear the skin and the surface muscle and bleed considerably, not enough to go deep or threaten anything vital. "When did this happen?" she said. "During the door business," Arthur said. "It's a graze, not a wound." "It's a wound," she said. She went for the medical kit again. "A graze is a wound." "A wound implies I should be doing less than I'm doing," Arthur said. "Which is not the case." "It implies you should let me bandage it," she said. "Which is the case." He let her bandage it. Jesse watched this exchange with the particular attention he gave to things he was filing away carefully. Then he looked out the broken front window at the street, where a small crowd had gathered at the distance, miners and merchants and townspeople who'd heard the shots and come out to see, standing in the snow on Main Street with their breath-making clouds in the cold air. He went to the window frame and looked at them. They looked back. Cal was there, in the front of the small crowd. He'd come from his house when he heard the shots, which meant Kitchie and Thomas were still at his house, which was where they needed to be. Cal looked at Jesse, and then at the building, still standing no smoke, and his shoulders came down from where they'd been. Jesse nodded at him. Cal nodded back. The covering man in the alley crane had been helped to his feet by a miner who'd come around the building to look. Crane was sitting on the alley ground, with his back against the building wall, and his right arm across his chest, looking disgruntled but not dangerously injured. The miner standing over him appeared to be making sure he stayed where he was. The man who'd run from the oil cans was not visible. Jesse noted his absence and set it aside for the moment. The man had run without the can and without completing his job, which meant he'd been spooked rather than committed. And spooked men generally kept running rather than regrouping. He'd surface somewhere, and when he did, Briggs's signed statement would account for him. Maeve tied off Arthur's bandage and straightened up and looked at the room, her building, her father in the chair, and her storeroom with its 2 oak desks behind the connecting door and the flour sacks on the shelves with the bullet holes now in 2 of them, the white flour drifting out in a slow thread onto the storeroom floor like sand from a glass. The walls were still standing. The records were at Cal's house. Briggs was at the work table with his coffee. Arthur was in his chair with his shoulder wrapped and his Spencer on his knees, and his expression, the expression of a man who has been through worse and is relatively satisfied with the present outcome. Jesse came away from the window and looked at her, the same look he'd given her in the gallery at Shaft Ford, direct, honest, checking. Here is what is actually there. What do you need? I need to write a second formal account, she said. Everything that happened today, documented and dated, for the marshal's arrival. She looked at the flour drifting from the shot sacks. And I need new flour sacks. Jesse looked at the shot sacks. I'll get the flour, he said. Hardware store will have planks for the window, she said. I'll get those too. He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd left it before going out the door that afternoon and put it on. He paused. Maeve. She looked at him. He's used everything he has, Jesse said. The courts, the warrant, the deed pressure, the hired men. Each one failed, and each one is now on record as a failure. His voice was quiet and certain. He's out of moves that aren't his own exposure. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. That's when they're most dangerous. Jesse looked at her steadily. Yes, it is. He paused. We're not done. No, she said, but we're closer. He went out to get the flour and the window planks. Arthur watched him go. Then he looked at Maeve, with the particular look that had no words attached to it, the one that meant he'd been watching something develop and had formed a conclusion about it. She raised her eyebrows at him. He picked up his newspaper from the side table and opened it. She went to write the account. The news traveled fast. By the time the territorial marshal's men rode into Oakhaven, 2 days after the gunfight, the whole town already knew most of it. Briggs had signed his statement the morning after the attack, sitting at Maeve's work table with Thomas's primer pushed to one side and a fresh cup of Arthur's coffee going cold beside him. He'd told it straight Sterling's name, the freight agent in Laramie, the instructions about the records, all of it. Maeve had written it down word for word and had him sign each page. The marshal's deputy read through the stack of documents. She handed him the Briggs statement, the Bexar County wire, the invalid emergency declaration, the county sheriff's denial, the formal account of the gunfight, and said nothing for a long time, which was the response of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Sterling was in his office when they came for him. He didn't run. That surprised some people, and didn't surprise others. He was a man who had operated inside systems his whole life, and even when the system turned against him, he reached for its language. He told the marshal's deputy that he would require his attorney and that any statements he made would be made formally and through proper channels. The deputy listened politely and put the manacles on anyway. The coal company men watched from the office doorway and didn't move. Oakhaven's miners had been gathering since morning, not with weapons, exactly though a man carrying a pick on his way to work is a man carrying a pick, and the distinction between tool and argument depends considerably on context. They came up from the mine complex and down from the workers' housing and along the side streets, and they gathered at the perimeter of Sterling's office in a loose ring that was not a mob, and everyone present knew it, and no one was willing to be the first to call it something peaceful either. Cal was at the front. He wasn't shouting. He was just there, which said more than shouting would have. When the marshal's deputy brought Sterling out through the office door, the ring of miners went very quiet. Sterling walked through that silence with his walking stick and his broadcloth coat and his silver mustache, and he looked at the faces around him. And for the first time in anyone's memory in Oakhaven, he looked like a man who understood the precise dimensions of what he'd built and what it had cost. Nobody touched him. Nobody needed to. The deputy put him in the transport wagon. The wagon rolled south. The miners watched it go. Cal turned around and looked at the men behind him. "Back to work," he said. "Or home to your families. Your choice." He paused. "Tomorrow the town council gets a visitor." The town council met that afternoon in the freight depot, the same building where the harvest auction had been held. The same storm lamps overhead, though unlit now in the gray winter daylight. The session was not orderly, and it was not brief, but by the end of it, 3 things had been decided. The first, Sterling's inflated tax assessment on the post office parcel, was declared invalid, the record corrected to the standard residential rate. The second, the coal company's claimed right of inspection over commercial premises was revoked, pending a full review of its legal basis, which everyone in the room already knew didn't exist. The third was the one that mattered most to Maeve. The council voted to open Oakhaven's schoolhouse equally to all children in the township, regardless of heritage, background, or prior employment status. It was not a unanimous vote. 2 council members abstained. But it passed, and it went into the written record, and Maeve was there when it did. She sat in the back of the freight depot and listened to the clerk, read the motion into the minutes, and she thought about the lantern in the storeroom. 8 months of backroom lessons. 2 boys learning to read by lamplight while the town council passed resolutions about who deserved. An education. Now it was in the record. It had the weight of the record. She looked across the room to where Kitchy and Thomas were sitting together on a bench near the door. Thomas with his arms crossed, and his expression working to stay neutral. Kitchy watching the council proceedings with the careful attention he gave to everything. He caught her eye. He nodded once. She nodded back. That evening, Jessie found Arthur in the parlor. The old man was in his chair by the stove, which was where he lived these days more than anywhere else. His shoulder wrapped and his breathing slower than Maeve, liked but steadier than it had been in the weeks before the gunfight. Arthur was looking at the fire through the stove grate. He didn't look up when Jessie came in, which meant he'd heard him on the stairs and had decided to let him come to it in his own time. Jessie sat down across from him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The stove cracked and settled. "She's going to want to rebuild here before she agrees to leave," Arthur said, finally. "Not because she's afraid to go. Because she needs to know it stands on its own before she walks away from it." "I know," Jessie said. "The schoolhouse vote helps." "Yes." Arthur looked at him then, directly, the old veteran's eyes still sharp in the worn face. "She's spent 10 years making this town safer for people it would rather forget. You understand what it costs her to hand that to someone else." "I do," Jessie said. "Do you?" Jessie was quiet a moment. "I built a room in my house and didn't finish it for 2 years," he said, "because I knew what it needed to be, and I wasn't willing to make it something else just to fill the space." He looked at Arthur evenly. "I understand what it means to hold something specific open." Arthur studied him. Then, from the back room, the sound of Thomas reading aloud, slow and deliberate, each word placed with intention. And Kitchy's voice after, low, correcting something, and Thomas reading the corrected version. And it was better the second time. Arthur listened to it. Something eased in his face, around the eyes and the set of his jaw. The way a man looks when he hears proof of something he'd hoped for but hadn't been certain of. "She's going to need the deed in both names," Arthur said, "before anything else." "I know," Jessie said. "And the school under her name specifically, not the ranch name. Hers. Already written that way in the Helena paperwork," Jessie said. Arthur looked at the stove for another moment. Then he said, "My trunks aren't going to pack themselves." Jessie looked at him. "I've got 2 good weeks left in this cold. before the cough gets worse," Arthur said. "I'd rather spend them moving north than sitting in this chair." He coughed once, controlled it, waved it off. "Go tell my daughter to stop rebuilding everything before she's willing to leave. Some things are allowed to be handed over incomplete." Jesse stood. He paused at the parlor door and looked back at Arthur. "Thank you," he said. Arthur picked up his newspaper. "Thank me by building her something that lasts," he said, and opened to the front page. That night, when the post office was closed and Arthur was asleep, and Thomas and Kitschy were at Cal's. For the evening, Maeve sat at her desk with the deed paperwork from Helena spread in front of her. She read through each page carefully, the way she read everything, looking for what was actually there, not what she hoped was there. It was real. Both names. Equal standing. The school under her name with full independent authority over its operation and enrollment. The ranch co-owned, decisions shared. She thought about the lien notice Sterling had put on her counter 2 months ago. She thought about the boundary cedar and the silver horseshoe and a man riding in through a dust storm like he hadn't been gone 20 years. She thought about Kitschy and Thomas reading to each other on their oak desks. She signed the paperwork. All of it. Every page. Then she went upstairs and knocked on the loft frame. Jesse looked up from his cot. She held up the signed papers. "I need your signature," she said, "and then we need to get to Helena before February." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached for his pen. Arthur's trunks were packed inside 4 days. He did it himself, mostly, which Maeve knew better than to argue with. She helped with the heavy ones and said nothing about the cough that followed each lift. And he said nothing about the fact that she was watching him the whole time. They had that arrangement worked out between them. It had been working for years. The decisions about the post office took longer. Maeve sat with Cal and 3 of the senior miners for 2 evenings in the storeroom, at the oak desks with a lantern between them, going through the operational structure of what she was leaving behind. The post office itself was federal. It would get a new postmaster from the Territorial Appointment Office. That couldn't be helped. But the dry goods operation and the building parcel were another matter. She'd been thinking about it since the council meeting. "A cooperative," she said on the second evening. She set a hand-drawn diagram on the table. Rough, functional, the kind you draw while you're thinking. The miners' cooperative holds the building deed. Operating income goes into a shared account administered by an elected 3-person committee. No single owner. No single point of pressure. Cal looked at the diagram. He turned it 90 degrees, looked at it again. "Who elects the committee?" "Dues-paying cooperative members," Maeve said, "which would include the mining families, the freight workers, whoever joins. It's 1 vote per household, not 1 vote per dollar." The miners looked at each other. The particular look of people who have been given something and are checking to make sure it isn't going to be taken back. "Why not just sell it?" one of them asked. "Because selling it means 1 buyer," Maeve said. 1 buyer can be pressured. 1 buyer can be bought. A cooperative with 40 members is considerably harder to move. She looked around the table. This town held against Sterling, because enough people made the same decision at the same time. The cooperative is that decision in a legal structure. It keeps holding even after I'm gone. More silence. Thoughtful. "I'll draw up the charter," Maeve said, "if you'll sign it." They signed it on the 3rd day. Arthur witnessed it from his chair, with the Spencer, leaning against the wall behind him, and his pen steady. Jesse spent those same days at the livery, preparing the horses and the wagon for the mountain route north. He bought a 2nd horse from the liveryman, a sturdy roan with good feet for snow travel, and repacked the supply load for a party of 5. He said nothing about the logistics to Maeve, unless she asked, which was partly practical, and partly because he understood that the leaving was something she needed to do in her own order. He understood about orders of things. He'd built a ranch house 1 room at a time. On the last morning, before they left, Maeve closed the post office for the final time herself. She went through the building alone. She checked the stove, the postal counter, the storeroom shelves. She stood for a while at the work table, with her hand on the surface of Thomas's desk, the worn edge where he pressed his forearm, the spot on the wood where 8 months of evenings had left their mark. She left both desks where they were. For the next teacher, whoever that turned out to be. Desks like those take time to build right. She locked the front door, and then she stood on the boardwalk, with the key in her hand for a moment. And then she put the key in her coat pocket and walked south. Jesse was waiting at the boundary seater. He hadn't arranged this. She'd just walked south without saying where she was going, and he'd known where she was going, and he'd gotten there first, which was either intuition or the kind of familiarity that builds up over 2 months of living in the same building and paying attention. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and the bay horse behind him, and when she came through the pine brake, he turned and looked at her, but didn't speak. She went to the tree. The initials were still there, the carved letters ridged over with decades of bark growth, still legible if you knew to look, MT plus JM. Below them, the 4 words worn but present, I'll come back. Promise? She traced them with 2 fingers, same as the first night. Then she reached into her coat pocket. She took out the silver horseshoe and held it out to him on her palm, not giving it back, just holding it between them, the engraved coordinates catching the winter light. He looked at it. He looked at her. A promise made by 10-year-olds, she said, was about finding one another again. Jesse was quiet a moment. Then, the promise we make today is about building a sanctuary where no one has to stand alone. She closed her hand around the horseshoe and put it back in her pocket. He reached into his trail coat and produced a folded document. Not the deed papers, she'd seen those. This was something else, something he'd had drawn up separately, and he held it out to her without ceremony. She unfolded it. It was the co-ownership deed for the Bitterroot Ranch, fully registered and stamped by the Helena Land Office. Both names, equal standing, and at the bottom, a separate addendum with its own heading, its own registration number. The Thornton Free School at Bitterroot Ranch. Her name, her authority. Her structure, legally recognized, independent of the ranch deed, standing on its own. She read it through twice. She read the addendum 3 times. You went to Helena already, she said. Before the saloon hearing, he said. I filed when I was passing through on the fall horse run. Wanted it settled so it couldn't be contested later. He paused. The addendum was my idea. The name was yours. I just put it on paper where it would stay. She looked at the addendum, the Thornton Free School. Her father's name. Her name. On a legal document in the territory of Montana, standing independent and intact. She folded the deed carefully and put it in her document case. She looked at the boundary seater one more time. At the initials. At the 4 words underneath. All right, she said. Let's go north. They rode back through the pine brake and into town, where Arthur was waiting on the boardwalk with his 2 packed trunks and his Spencer and his expression of a man who is very ready to leave a place he has spent too many years in. Thomas was beside him, wearing the wool coat that actually fit him now. Maeve had made sure of that with his primer tucked under his arm because he went nowhere important without it. Kitchy stood slightly behind, watching the street with his usual attention, already calculating the road ahead. Cal was there. Several miners. The women from the auxiliary who had watched the auction with their arms crossed and watched the town council meeting with something different in their eyes. Briggs was there too, improbably, standing at the edge of the group with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who was trying to figure out if he was allowed to be present. Maeve looked at him and nodded once, and he stopped trying to figure it out. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed to. Cal shook Jesse's hand. He put his other hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder. He looked at Kitchy and said, "You've got a good eye. Use it for good things." And Kitchy looked back at him and said, "I will." Maeve hugged 2 of the auxiliary women and let Arthur shake Cal's hand and didn't rush any of it, because these were not moments to rush. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. Jesse mounted the bay. Arthur settled himself into the wagon bed, between his trunks, with the Spencer across his knees, and Thomas climbed up beside Maeve on the seat, and Kitchy took the roan's reins and rode alongside. They went north. The road out of Oakhaven ran past the mine complex, first past Shaft 4, with its new timber supports and the inspection board nailed to the housing wall, past the dispatch tower with its bell quiet in the winter morning. Then it curved west, and the town fell behind them, and the open territory opened up ahead, white and wide, and crossed with the cold tracks of the previous week's travel. Maeve did not look back. She knew what was there. She'd put it in a cooperative and a signed charter, and the town council's written record, and it would stand or it wouldn't, and there was no more she could do about it from the wagon seat than she'd already done from behind a postal counter. What was ahead she hadn't built yet. That was different. That was something. The horseshoe was in her coat pocket, the coordinates engraved on its inner curve. She knew what those numbers meant now. The valley, the watershed, the ranch house with the unfinished room. She'd never seen any of it, and she was riding toward all of it. And the feeling that produced was not quite fear and not quite certainty, but something moving in the direction of both. Jessie rode beside the wagon on her left. "How far to the first pass?" she asked. 2 days in good weather, he said. 3 if the north roads drifted. And from the pass to Bitterroot? Another day and a half. She did the arithmetic. "Thomas," she said, "you'll need to read to your grandfather for at least 1 hour per day while we travel. Road time is not an excuse for falling behind." Thomas beside her looked up from his primer. "I know," he said, with the tone of someone who had already thought of this and was mildly insulted at the implication that he hadn't. Jessie looked across at Thomas and then up at Maeve with the corner of his mouth moved slightly. She kept her eyes on the road, but she was smiling. Spring came late to the Bitterroot Valley. It came the way it always did up there, not gradually but suddenly the way a door opens. 1 week, the peaks were solid white, and the valley floor was frozen mud and bare grass. And then one morning, the south-facing slopes showed green along the creek banks, and the horses were restless in the barn, and the smell of the air had changed entirely. And that was that. Winter was done. The ranch house sat on a gentle rise above the creek, facing east, so the morning light hit the porch first. Jesse had built it in his second summer on the land, and he'd built it to last heavy timber frame, deep-set windows, a porch that ran the full width of the front. The barn behind it had 8 stalls, all occupied now. The kitchen garden was already marked out for spring planting, the soil turned and waiting. And the room at the north end of the house, the one Jessie had never finished it, had walls and windows and a good plank floor and nothing else, waiting to become what it needed to be. By April, it had desks, real ones, 8 of them, built over the winter by Jessie and Thomas, working together in the barn on the slow days when the snow was too deep for outdoor work. Thomas had gotten good enough with the plane that his surfaces were smooth on the first pass now. Kitchy had built the bookshelves along the east wall, solid and level, already half full, with the books Maeve had brought from Oakhaven and the new ones she'd ordered through the Helena post office before the winter closed. Children came before the official opening. They came from the valley settlements, and from the 2 homesteads to the north, and from the indigenous families along the upper creek, who had heard, through the quiet channels that communities use when official channels aren't safe, that there was a school on the Bitterroot Ranch where everyone was welcome and no one was turned away. Maeve didn't announce an opening date. She just left the door open, and the children found it. Thomas taught the youngest ones to read their letters, sitting at his desk at the front of the room, with the patience of someone who remembered what it felt like to not know them. He was 13 now, and he worked with the little ones the way Jessie had worked, with him no performance, just information given straight. Kitchy handled the older students in mathematics and in the naturalist observations he'd been developing all winter, teaching them to track weather patterns and read the creek's water levels and understand the land they lived on. He was 15, and he spoke with the authority of a person who has studied something real and knows it. Maeve taught everything else. Arthur sat on the porch in the good weather, with his tea and his Spencer and his newspaper. And the children treated him as a fixed feature of the landscape, the way they treated the barn cats and the creek and the sound of Jesse's horses in the pasture. He'd stopped coughing as much since they'd come north. The mountain air was cleaner. He'd never say so directly, but he'd mentioned twice that his chest felt easier on the cold mornings, which was the closest he was going to get to admitting that leaving Oakhaven had been the right decision for him personally. The wedding was in May. Maeve and Jesse stood on the porch of the ranch house in the early morning, before the valley heat built, with the Bitterroot peaks gleaming in the new light and the creek running clear and loud below the rise. The justice of the peace came up from the valley settlement, a practical woman named Holt, who ran the land registry office and had no patience for ceremonies that ran long. They didn't run long. The guests were the people who mattered. Cal had made the journey north with 2 other miners and their families. A 4-day ride that he said was fine, and arrived looking like it had been considerably more than fine, but was determined not to be complained about. Briggs was there. He'd testified fully before the federal authorities, and had been working an honest freight route out of Helena since winter, and Jesse had sent him a letter in March with the date and the coordinates. He'd shown up with a bottle of good whiskey, and the look of a man who had found, improbably, that second chances were a real thing. Kitchy stood at Jesse's shoulder. Thomas stood beside Arthur, who was seated in his good chair that Jesse had carried from inside the house to the porch specifically for this morning. The justice asked the plain questions and got plain answers. Jesse looked at Maeve when he said his. Directly, the way he looked at everything he meant. She looked back at him the same way. No performance in it. Just the truth of it, said in front of people who knew the full story and had watched it develop, and were glad to be there at the end of the building. Afterward, there was food. The Valley families had brought enough to feed twice the crowd, which was what communities do when they want to make sure nobody feels like a guest. The children from the school ran in the yard, and the horses watched from the pasture fence with their ears forward, and Thomas read a passage aloud to Arthur from his primer, loudly, because Arthur's hearing had gotten somewhat selective in his old age, and Arthur listened with his eyes closed and his tea in his hands, and did not correct Thomas's pronunciation once. Kitchy sat on the porch rail and watched the valley in the spring light. After a while, Jesse came and stood beside him. "How many students next fall?" Jesse asked. "More than the room holds," Kitchy said. Jesse looked at the north end of the house, at the room that was already the school. He looked at the open ground to the east of the building, level and clear, good for a foundation. "We can extend," he said. Kitchy nodded. He already knew this. He'd been looking at that ground all winter. Inside the house, Maeve was at the kitchen table with the Valley women, talking about the fall curriculum and what books needed to be ordered, and whether the creek crossing was safe enough for the younger children to manage in the rain season. She was writing notes in her ledger as she talked, the same precise hand she used for everything, the same attention she brought to telegraph dispatches and land office filings and Thomas's spelling tests. Arthur appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there looking at her with the expression he'd had when she signed the cooperative charter, the expression that had no words attached to it, the one that meant he'd watched something build and had formed his final conclusion about it. She looked up. He raised his teacup toward her slightly. She raised her pen back. He went back to his chair on the porch. Later, when the guests had gone, and Arthur was asleep, and the children from the valley settlements had ridden home with their families and the ranch was quiet, in the long spring evening, Jesse and Maeve walked down to the creek. It ran clear, spring-fed from the high passes, clean even in drought season, the way he'd told her the night he handed her the horseshoe. She could see the stones on the bottom, and the small, quick fish moving in the current, and her own reflection in the still edge of a pool where the water went quiet before it turned. She took the horseshoe out of her coat pocket. She'd carried it since Oakhaven. Through the saloon hearing, and the gunfight, and the valley road, and the winter, and the planting of the kitchen garden, and the building of the school desks. She turned it over in her hands, the engraved coordinates worn slightly at the edges from the months of handling. She looked at the creek. She looked at Jesse. "I was going to say something significant," she said. "Were you?" he said. "I had something prepared, and it seems unnecessary now." She looked at the horseshoe. "I think it just goes in my pocket and stays there." Jesse looked at the creek. "That's fine," he said. She put it back in her pocket. They stood by the water for a while in the spring quiet. The Bitterroot peaks caught the last light above them going gold, and then rose, and then the deep blue of high-altitude dusk. The creek ran. The horses moved in the pasture, above the rise. What they'd built was behind them on that rise the house and the barn and the schoolroom and the garden and all the people they'd carried here with them. It was imperfect in the ways real things are imperfect. The east wall of the school needed another window. Thomas still wrote his lowercase g wrong. Arthur's cough came back in the cold mornings. The land office in Helena had sent 3 more letters requiring various responses. None of that was finished. It was just continuing, which was what it was supposed to do. The initials on the old cedar in Oakhaven were still there. She knew that, without needing to go back. Bark grows over carved letters and holds them in place. A 10-year-old's promise, kept against long odds, was now a grown thing standing on its own in a ledger in Helena. In the records of the cooperative in Oakhaven, in the schoolroom behind them, with the 8 desks and the full bookshelves and the open door. Some promises are kept in a moment. Some are kept every single day. This one, she understood now, was both. Jesse didn't say anything, and neither did she, and the creek ran on, and the mountains held the last light a long time before they let it go. This story is entirely fictional. All characters, events, and dialogue are products of the author's imagination. Historical Western settings are used for storytelling purposes only, and are not intended as an accurate account of real events or persons.